Marlo Bennett's hands were still shaking when she wrapped that last slice of pie. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. The bank letter was folded inside her apron pocket, pressed flat against her ribs like a wound. $300, 60 days. And not a soul in Rattler Creek had offered so much as a sympathetic nod. Then his boot stopped at her table. She didn't look up. "Same as always," Silas Mercer said quietly. And Marlo, without thinking, without planning, without any good reason at all, placed the pie on a plate instead of wrapping it to go. If this story is touching your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. I promise you, this one goes somewhere you won't expect. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The bank letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Marlo read it twice standing in the cold at the back of her rented room, then folded it so small it nearly disappeared between her fingers. $300 past due on the lease agreement she'd signed with old Gerald Prentice 2 winters ago. 60 days to settle the balance or vacate the space she used for storage. The little shed behind the feed store where she kept her flour sacks and preserving jars, and the good copper mixing bowl her mother had carried west on a wagon before Marlo was even born. She owed $300 she did not have. She placed the letter inside her apron pocket and went back to work. That was Tuesday. By Saturday morning, she'd thought through every possible arrangement and dismissed them all. She could sell the copper bowl, but it wouldn't bring enough. She could ask the mercantile owner, Mr. Aldridge, for an advance on the bread she supplied him each week, but she already owed him for last month's flour. She could ask Eleanor Thatch, who ran the dress shop and had always been kind, but Eleanor had her own troubles since her husband's gambling debts had come due in the fall. There was no one to ask. There was never anyone to ask. That understanding had lived inside Marlo's chest since she was 19 years old, when her mother passed and left her with nothing but that copper bowl, a rented room, and the knowledge that a woman alone in Rattler Creek, Wyoming Territory, had better be worth something to someone, or she would simply be invisible. So she became worth something. She baked. She baked with a precision and a stubbornness that people in town had long since stopped noticing, because the bread was always there, the pies were always there, and Marlo Bennett was always there, reliable as a post, quiet as a fence rail, and just as easy to overlook. She set up her stall in the market square every Saturday before dawn. Bread loaves wrapped in cloth, small crocks of apple butter. 4 kinds of pie when she could manage it: apple, peach in summer, dried apricot in the lean months, and chess pie when she had nothing else but eggs and butter and a little cornmeal. She set her prices low because she knew what the wives paid attention to, and she knew how tight money ran through this town. She made enough to survive, barely enough to keep dreaming. The dream was the empty building at the corner of Sulphur Street and 2nd. A real bakery, her name on the glass, a proper oven instead of the borrowed one she hauled to and from the market on a flatbed cart. Heat that she controlled, hours that she chose. A place where she wasn't a woman selling things from a wooden table in a mud lot, but a businesswoman with a shop that belonged to her. She'd walked past that building so many times she knew every crack in its foundation. She knew the way the morning light came through the east-facing window and landed on the empty floor in a wide, warm rectangle. She knew the building needed a new front door and some work along the back wall where the wood had softened with moisture. She knew it had been empty for 2 years since the cobbler who'd rented it moved his family to Cheyenne. She knew she couldn't afford it. She dreamed about it anyway. That Saturday morning she set up her stall the same as always. She didn't allow herself to think about the bank letter. Thinking about it wouldn't change it, and it would certainly ruin her focus, and a distracted baker was a careless baker, and careless baking was something her mother had never permitted. "Do the work in front of you," her mother used to say. The rest will come around or it won't. The market filled up around her. Vegetable sellers, a man with chickens, the hardware merchant's boy hauling nails and rope, women moving through the rows with their baskets, pausing, considering, Moving on. Marlowe sold 3 loaves before 9 o'clock and a chess pie to Mrs. Garvey, who always said she was buying it for her husband but never quite met Marlowe's eyes when she said it. She was wrapping a jar of apple butter when she heard the boots. She knew the sound of them. That was the thing she'd never admitted to herself until that moment that she knew his walk. She knew the particular deliberate weight of it, the way it didn't shuffle or hurry, the way it covered ground without performing anything. She knew it the way you knew a sound you'd heard so often it had become part of the air around you. Silas Mercer stopped at the end of her table. He was not a tall man in the way that drew immediate attention. He was broad from the shoulders, weathered in the hands and jaw, and had a stillness about him that some people mistook for coldness until they'd spent more than 5 minutes in his company. His hat was the same battered brown felt it always was. His coat was clean but worn at the elbows. He looked like a man who spent his days doing real work and had no time left over to look like anything else. "Morning," he said. "Morning, Mr. Mercer." Marlowe finished tying the apple butter jar without rushing it. Same as always, if you've got it, she had it. She'd had it every Saturday for nearly a year. She'd started keeping one back for him after the 3rd Saturday he'd shown up, and the apple pie had already sold out by the time he arrived. She'd felt something she couldn't name when she saw his face fall just slightly, just for a second, and then compose itself into polite acceptance. It wasn't a dramatic expression. She doubted he'd even noticed she'd seen it. But she'd noticed, and the next week she kept one back. She sliced it without asking, wrapped it in paper. Then, without knowing why, without planning to, without any reasonable explanation she could have offered if someone had asked her, she reached under the table for one of the 2 good plates she kept there and placed the slice on it instead. She set it on the table in front of him. "Why don't you eat it here for once?" Silas Mercer looked at the plate. He looked at her. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and felt considerably longer. "Only if the baker comes with it," he said. His voice was entirely level when he said it. His face didn't change much, but his eyes, which were a quiet gray that she'd noticed without meaning to sometime around the 5th or 6th Saturday, held something in them that Marlowe hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. Maybe ever. He meant it as an easy thing to say, a small joke between 2 people who'd stood across a table from each other for 50 Saturdays and exchanged nothing more dangerous than money and pie. But it landed on her like a stone dropped into still water. She didn't answer him right away. She busied herself with the apple butter jar, the one she'd already finished tying, and said, almost to herself, "I've still got customers." "I know it," Silas said. He picked up the plate and paid her. He didn't go anywhere. He stood at the end of her table and ate the pie right there, slowly, the way a man ate something he was actually tasting. Marlowe sold 2 more loaves of bread and refused to look at him. He left when he was finished, set the plate back on her table, touched the brim of his hat, and said, "Much obliged," the same way he said it every week. She didn't say anything until he was gone. Then she allowed herself one long exhale, pressed her hand flat against the bank letter in her apron pocket, and told herself very firmly that Silas Mercer had made a joke, and she was a woman with serious financial problems who had no business reading anything into a joke made over apple pie by a grieving widower who probably didn't even know what he'd said. That was very sensible. She believed it for almost 3 full days. The following Saturday he came back. He didn't mention what he'd said the week before. He bought his pie wrap this time, because Marlowe had decided firmly that the plate had been a mistake born of a sleepless Tuesday through Friday, and she was not going to repeat it. Paid exactly, touched his hat, and started to go. Then he stopped. "That table's been sitting crooked since September," he said, without turning around. Marlowe frowned. "Excuse me?" He turned. He was looking at the right rear leg of her market table, which had indeed been sitting slightly short since September, which meant the whole surface tilted maybe 3 degrees to the left, and she'd been compensating for it so automatically that she'd stopped noticing. "Front leg was replaced," he said. "Whoever did it cut it half an inch too long, or the back one's half an inch too short. Either way, the whole thing lists. She stared at him. How long have you noticed that? He considered September. That's been 4 months, mister. Mercer, I know it. And you're saying something now because I've got the tools in my wagon today, and I've got 10 minutes. He said it like it was the most practical thing in the world. If you want. Marlowe looked at him. She looked at her table. She looked at the slight list she'd been correcting every week without thinking about it. All right, she said. He fixed it in 7 minutes. He didn't make a production of it. He didn't ask her to clear the table or make her feel like a burden. He simply worked around her while she continued selling, lifted the table with practiced ease, checked the legs with the kind of eye that came from years of building and repairing things, cut a thin shim from a scrap of wood in his wagon, and set the table back down level. Try it, he said. She pressed both palms flat on the surface. Perfectly even. Thank you, she said. He nodded, loaded his tools back into the wagon, and left. Marlowe stood there for a moment with both hands still flat on the table. She thought about how long it took to notice something that had been crooked for 4 months. She thought about how a person could walk right past a problem every single week and never say a word about it until the day they had the tools to fix it. She wasn't sure she was only thinking about the table. The weeks that followed moved quietly, the way meaningful things often did in Rattler Creek, not announced, not celebrated, just accumulating like early snow on a fence rail. Each Saturday added one small thing to the understanding that was building between them without either of them naming it. He began arriving a little earlier, not so early that anyone would have noticed or remarked upon it. Just early enough that sometimes he was at her table before the market rush when she had a moment to breathe, and they spoke about things that were not particularly important and somehow mattered. She told him about her mother's recipe for the chess pie and the particular instruction to never rush the bake even when the kitchen was hot and you were tired. He told her about a foal that had been born sideways in the middle of March and how the first night had been uncertain, but the animal had proven to be stubborn enough to make it. Sounds like someone I know, Marlowe said, before she caught herself. Silas looked at her. I reckon it does, he said entirely without irony. She learned things about him in the way you learned things about a man who was careful with words. Not from what he said, but from what he chose to mention and what he left out. He mentioned his cattle with precision and with obvious care. He mentioned the 2 ranch hands who worked for him with a kind of quiet respect she found unusual in men who employed other men. He mentioned the town's new circuit judge, with a measured opinion that told her he'd given the matter actual thought rather than simply repeating what he'd heard at the saloon. He never mentioned his wife. She understood that too. She'd heard about Evelyn Mercer the way you heard about anything in a town this small in fragments, from women who meant well and talked too easily. Evelyn had been dark-haired and quick-tempered, and apparently possessed of a laugh that could be heard from half a block away. She'd died of a fever 3 winters back, fast and without much warning, and Silas had been at the ranch alone since then. He didn't come to town socials. He didn't attend church with any regularity. He bought his supplies, tended his cattle, and kept his grief folded away somewhere nobody could see it. Marlowe recognized the method. She used it herself. One Saturday in late spring, the conversation turned to the empty building on Sulphur Street. She hadn't brought it up. She almost never spoke about it aloud because speaking about it made the distance between wanting it and having it feel larger somehow. But a woman selling lace trim had mentioned in passing that the building was still available, and wasn't it a shame, such a good corner location going to waste? Silas turned to Marlowe with a directness that surprised her. Is that the one you've been thinking about? She blinked. I don't know what you mean. For the bakery. He said it simply without performance. You've been thinking about opening a permanent shop. That building on 2nd Street. I've seen you look at it when you come through on Fridays. Marlowe felt something very odd and not entirely comfortable, which was the sensation of being seen by someone who had been paying attention when she'd assumed she was invisible. "It's a fine location," she said carefully. "It is," he agreed. He looked out towards Sulphur Street, though they couldn't see it from the market. "Good foot traffic from the eastern side of town. That window faces southeast, so you'd get morning light into the afternoon if you wanted it." She studied his profile. "You've thought about it more than I have." "I've thought about what works for someone selling things." He looked back at her. "You'd fill it." The certainty in his voice was quiet but absolute, the way he said everything. Not an encouragement, not a hollow compliment, just a plain statement that he believed to be true. Marlowe swallowed something she didn't have a name for. "The rent would be considerable," she said. "Probably. And I'd need to update the oven setup. The back wall needs some attention. That's wood rot from poor drainage most likely. Fixable." "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "have you been inside that building?" A pause once, 2 springs ago. Crawford the cobbler had a harness I was after. He met her eyes. "It's got good bones." She looked away toward the market crowd. "It has," she said quietly. "It really does. They didn't speak of it again that day." But something had shifted. She felt it in the way a room feels different. After someone opens a window, the air is the same, but it's moving. The bank letter was still in her apron pocket. She hadn't answered it because she didn't have the answer yet. She'd managed to scrape together $40 by selling a piece of her mother's silver-handled mirror, set something she'd told herself 100 times she would never sell, and she had another 3. Weeks before Gerald Prentice's 60 days ran out. $260 short. She didn't tell anyone. She wouldn't have known who to tell. That was when summer arrived in Rattler Creek, pushing in over the mountains with a heat that dried the roads to hardpell ribbons and brought the farmers into town looking for ice and good news about the rains coming soon. Marlowe's baking moved faster in summer. The warm months brought more people through the market, and people in good weather were more inclined to spend. She sold more peach preserves in June and July than in all the other months combined. She saved everything she could. It was not going to be enough. She was calculating her shortfall for the 3rd time one particularly hot Friday afternoon, sitting at the back of her rented room with the copper bowl in her lap for no reason except that holding it steadied her when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Silas Mercer standing on the step. She stared at him. He had never come to her room before. She didn't know how he knew where she lived. It wasn't a secret the rented rooms behind the seamstress's shop were one of 2 options for single women in town, but he had never had occasion to use the knowledge before. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Miss Bennett." He held his hat in both hands, which was the only indication that this was not an entirely comfortable visit. "I apologize for the hour." I heard he stopped. Recalibrated. "There's talk about old Prentice and the storage lease situation." "I wasn't looking for the information. It came to me." Marlowe felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the summer. "It's being handled, I don't doubt it." He looked directly at her. "I came to say that if it would help, I've got credit at the lumber mill and Aldridge owes me a significant favor from last fall. I'm not offering money, Miss Bennett. I wouldn't presume. I'm offering," he seemed to choose the next word with the care of a man diffusing something, "use of resources. If you needed them." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. "Because you've been keeping my table level since September," he said, with a faint edge of dry honesty that nearly undid her, "and I have been benefiting from that every Saturday, and it occurs to me that's a debt worth acknowledging." She understood he wasn't really talking about the table. "I can handle my own business, Mr. Mercer. I know that, no hesitation. I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm suggesting that accepting help when it's offered freely isn't the same as needing it." Marlowe stood in her doorway with the copper bowl held against her ribs and looked at Silas Mercer, standing on her step in the summer heat, turning his hat in his hands. saying the most careful and considered and unexpectedly honest thing anyone had said to her in as long as she could remember. "I'll think about it," she said. Something in his expression settled. "That's all I'm asking," he said. He put his hat back on, touched the brim, and left. She stood in the doorway until she couldn't hear his horse anymore. Then she went inside, set the copper bowl on the table, sat down beside it, and allowed herself, for the first time in a very long time, to feel something she'd trained herself to be deeply suspicious of. Hope. She didn't know what to do with it. She kept it anyway. The next Saturday, Silas arrived at the market and found her table empty. Not empty, gone. The space where Marlowe's stall had stood every Saturday for 3 years was occupied by a man selling rope and leather goods who looked at Silas with complete indifference when he asked where the baker had gone. "Ain't seen her," the rope seller said. Silas stood in the market square in the bright July heat and felt something travel through him that he hadn't felt in years, a sudden irrational cold in the middle of summer that had nothing to do with the temperature. He asked Mrs. Garvey, who was emerging from the vegetable cellars with a full basket. She frowned. "Now that you mention it, I don't believe she set up today." "Funny. She's always here," he asked the hardware merchant's boy, who shrugged. He stood there for another 30 seconds, telling himself there was a perfectly reasonable explanation, and then he untied his horse from the post and rode east out of Rattler Creek toward the flat land that eventually gave way to the low hills where his ranch sat, and where, 7 miles north of his own fence line, the Bennett family had once worked a claim before Marlowe's father passed, and the land was sold off to pay his debts. He told himself he was riding home. He passed his own gate. He found her 2 hours later, not at her room, not at the market. He'd nearly lost the trail of the thing that was pulling him when he saw her wagon half hidden behind a screen of cottonwood trees along the creek road, one wheel sitting awkward at an angle that said clearly something had gone wrong. He rode in. She was sitting on the wagon box with her arms crossed over her chest and her jaw set in the particular way he'd come to recognize as Marlowe Bennett refusing to show anything she didn't intend to show. The wheel had come off the axle. The flatbed she used to haul her oven and equipment to and from market every week had shed its rear left wheel somewhere along the road, and she'd managed to walk the horses to a stop before the whole rig could tip. She looked at him when he rode up. "I don't need help," she said. "No," he agreed. He dismounted and walked around the wagon, studying the axle. "You don't, but I'm here anyway." He crouched down and looked at the spindle. "The pin's gone. She's been wearing loose for a while." "You've probably felt it for weeks." A long silence. "I have," she said. "I kept meaning to get it looked at." He worked in silence. She stayed on the wagon box. After a while, she climbed down and stood beside him while he worked the wheel back onto the axle, because standing and watching wasn't something she was built for. "Hold this," he said, handing her the edge of the brace. She held it. They worked together without speaking for a long stretch. The cottonwoods made shade, and the creek made sound, and the horses were patient, which horses generally were when nothing was happening to alarm them. "She's set," he said finally. Marlowe tested the wheel. "Solid, thank you," she said. He straightened up and dusted off his knees. He was about to say something ordinary, something about getting back to the ranch, something about seeing her next Saturday, when he looked at her face and saw what she'd been hiding since he rode up. Her eyes were red, not from the dust, not from the sun. From the particular kind of tired that lived behind, crying you'd done before someone appeared, and then were determined not to do in front of them. He didn't say anything about it. He stood there and waited. She lasted about 4 seconds. "I lost the storage lease," she said. Her voice was steady and fierce and completely unconvincing. "Prentice sold the property. The new owner wants it cleared by the end of the month." So she exhaled. "My oven goes where exactly? I haven't worked that out yet." "Along with everything else I haven't worked out." Silas said nothing. "And the wheel," she continued, with a kind of compressed fury directed at inanimate objects that he found both painful and deeply recognizable. And I didn't set up today because I couldn't get the rig ready in time, and then the wheel came off, and she stopped. I am not, she said precisely, going to cry about a wagon wheel. No, he said, a person's allowed to be angry about a wagon wheel. She looked at him. He looked back. I'm angry, she said. I'm very angry, he said. The fury in her face fractured for just a moment. Just a crack. Just enough for him to see what was underneath it, not weakness, not the need to be rescued, but the plain, exhausted acknowledgement that she was one woman carrying an enormous amount with no one to set any of it down beside. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't tell her what to do. He just stayed where he was. And Marlo Bennett, who had not leaned on anyone since she was 19 years old and had promised herself she never would again, did not lean on Silas Mercer that afternoon. But she stopped leaning away from him, and that, between two people as carefully armored as these two were, was not nothing. It was, in fact, the beginning of everything. Marlo went back to work the following Monday, like the wagon wheel had never happened, and the cottonwood trees along the creek road had never witnessed anything worth remembering. That was how she operated. That was how she'd always operated. You put the difficult thing in a drawer, you pushed the drawer shut, and you kept moving. Sentiment was a luxury for women who had people to be sentimental with, and Marlo had long since stopped counting herself among that number. She found a temporary arrangement for her oven a corner of the blacksmith's yard, screened off by a half wall of stacked lumber, exposed to the wind from the north, but serviceable enough. Hector Blaine, the blacksmith, was a broad, easy-mannered man who'd bought her bread every week for 2 years and charged her less than she expected for the space. She suspected Eleanor Thatch had said something to him, but she didn't ask and Eleanor never mentioned it, which was the exact kind of kindness Marlo knew how to accept. She reset her Saturday stall. She adjusted her hours. She recalculated her savings to account for the lost storage arrangement and the cost of hauling everything to and from the blacksmith yard, which added 40 minutes to her morning and 30 to her evening, and left her exhausted in a way she refused to acknowledge even to herself. She did not think about Silas Mercer and the creek road and the moment she'd stopped leaning away from him. She thought about it constantly. The following Saturday he was at her table before the market rush. Earlier than he'd ever arrived before, he didn't comment on it. He bought his apple pie, paid for it, and then said, as though it were a continuation of something they'd already been discussing, the blacksmith's yard won't hold up once October comes. Too exposed on the north end. Marlo looked at him steadily. I know that. I've got a stone outbuilding on the east side of the ranch property, he said. It's solid. South-facing window. I put in a proper floor 2 years back when I was thinking about using it for a smokehouse. He paused. Never got around to the smokehouse. She studied him. That's 7 miles out of town, 6.5. Not apologetic. Not pushy. Simply accurate. You've been hauling equipment in a wagon that sheds wheels. The road to the ranch is better maintained than the creek road. The building has a working door, with a bolter. Mercer, I'm not offering charity, he said, the same way he'd said it on her doorstep in July. Completely level. I'm offering a building I'm not using to a baker who needs reliable storage before winter. If it makes the arrangement more comfortable for you, we can settle on a fair rent. She opened her mouth, closed it. What would you consider fair? She said finally. Something shifted in his expression, barely visible, but she caught it. She'd gotten good at catching his barely visible things. A loaf of bread, Fridays when you've got it. She stared at him. That's not a fair rent, Mr. Mercer. It's what I want, he said plainly. Take it or leave it. Marlo thought about the north wind coming through the gap in the blacksmith's lumber wall. She thought about October and November and the fact that she couldn't bake if her hands were frozen. She thought about stubbornness and pride and the very fine line between refusing help out of self-respect and refusing help out of sheer stupid habit. Fridays, she said, when I've got it. Much obliged, he said. He touched his hat and left. Marlowe watched him go and then turned back to her table and sold 3 jars of apple butter to Mrs. Garvey's daughter, who had just gotten engaged and was beginning to collect domestic things with the focused enthusiasm of the newly hopeful. She found herself unexpectedly moved by this. She wasn't sure exactly why. She tied the jars carefully and congratulated the girl, and then stood alone for a moment in the September market crowd, holding the weight of a transaction she couldn't quite name. She realized, beginning to hope again. That was the most terrifying thing that had happened to her in years. The outbuilding was exactly what he'd said it was. Stone walls, solid floor, south-facing window that let in enough light to work by on a clear day. A cast-iron wood stove in the corner with good draw. Enough space for her oven, her mixing tables, and the rows of shelving she needed for cooling racks and jar storage. It was, if she was being honest with herself, better than the shed behind the feed store that Prentice had rented her. Considerably better, and Silas had clearly done some quiet work. Before she arrived with her wagon, the stove had fresh blacking on it, and the window had a new leather hinge where the old one had rotted through. She didn't mention it. He didn't either. She brought the first bread loaf on a Friday afternoon in early October, knocked at the ranch house door, and stood on the porch waiting with the wrapped loaf in her hands and a feeling in her chest like she was 14 years old and had never done anything more complicated than knock on a door. Silas answered and took the loaf with the same straightforward manner he did everything. "Come in if you want coffee," he said. It was an easy offer. Just coffee. She went in. The ranch house was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she'd expected. It was clean in the way a man's house was clean when he lived alone and cared about order but had nobody to be particularly neat for things in their places. Surfaces clear. But a quiet utilitarian emptiness to it that she felt settle against her like a low draft. A good table, 4 chairs. Shelves with practical things on them. A coat rack near the door with his spare jacket hanging from it. And then on a hook just beside the window a woman's shawl. Cream-colored wool, slightly faded, hung with care, not forgotten or abandoned. Hung the way you kept something close because you weren't ready to let the closeness go. Marlowe looked at it and looked away. He handed her a tin cup of coffee that was strong and honest, and she appreciated both qualities. They sat at the table with the afternoon light coming in the window, and talked about ordinary things, the coming cold, the state of the roads, whether the early frost had hurt the apple harvest this year. He asked how the bakery business was holding up as winter approached, and she told him the truth, which was that winter was always lean, and she'd learned to prepare for it, which was different from looking forward to it. He listened the way he always listened, not waiting for pause to fill with his own words, but actually taking in what she said. It was a rare quality. She'd known men who could sit quietly and say nothing, and it meant nothing at all. They were simply waiting for you to finish so they could redirect the conversation toward themselves. Silas was quiet in a different way. His quiet meant he was present. "The chess pie," he said unexpectedly as she was nearly finished with her coffee. "The one you make in November, your mother's recipe." "What about it? You said she told you never to rush the bake." "What else did she tell you about it?" Marlowe sat with that for a moment. People didn't ask about her mother. People knew she'd had one, knew she was gone, and moved on, the way people in this country moved past deaths and absences, because there was always more present business demanding attention. "She said the crust needs patience," Marlowe said. She said people always wanted to hurry the crust, and the crust always knew. She looked into her coffee. She said you could taste the impatience in pastry. That you couldn't rush a good thing into being ready, and if you tried, the result always told on you. Silas said nothing for a moment. "That sounds like advice about more than pie," he said. Marlowe looked up at him. He was looking at the table, his hands wrapped around his cup, and his expression was the one she'd come to recognize as his most unguarded, not quite sad, not quite resigned. Somewhere in the country between those two things, where a man lived when he'd decided to stop expecting much and had discovered the decision didn't entirely take. "It might have been," she said carefully. He nodded. Said nothing more. But she felt something move between them across that table. Something that had no words in it, but didn't need them, a kind of recognition between two people who had both learned to rush past wanting things, because the alternative was waiting for something that might never come. She set down her cup and thanked him for the coffee, and went out to check on her equipment in the outbuilding before dark. On the way home, she held the reins loosely and thought about cream-colored shawls hung with care, and patience, and what it meant to stop rushing past the things that mattered. November arrived like a judgment. The wind came in off the mountains, cold and humorless, and the roads turned to iron, and the town of Rattler Creek pulled itself inward the way all small western towns did. When winter declared itself, people moved faster between buildings, socialized less in the open, gathered closer around their own fires. The market shifted mostly indoors to the hall beside the church, and Marlowe's stall moved with it, which she did not love. The hall was crowded and loud and smelled of other people's goods, but she adapted, as she always adapted. Her Fridays at the outbuilding became the steadiest part of her week. She'd arrive in the late afternoon, work through the early evening baking the Friday batches she'd carry to market in the morning. And more often than not, Silas would appear in the outbuilding doorway around supper time, with some reason to be checking on something nearby. He never manufactured excuses. He simply appeared, and if she had bread for him, he'd take it, and if she was still working, he'd sometimes sit on the three-legged stool he'd placed without comment, without announcement, against the wall near the stove, and talk to her while she worked, or not talk, which she found she didn't mind at all. One Friday evening he was later than usual. She'd finished the last batch and was banking the stove and wrapping the loaves when she heard his boots on the stone outside. He came in with cold on his coat and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. "Trouble?" she asked. "Nothing serious." He pulled the door shut against the wind. "One of the ranch hands gave notice today. His brother's place in Colorado needs a man. Can't fault him for it." He stood with his hat in his hands in the way she'd come to understand meant he was carrying something. "Leaves me short through winter. Ames can handle the daily work, but the fence line needs a second man in this cold." Marlowe finished wrapping the last loaf. "Will you hire someone?" "Have to." He ran a hand along the back of his neck. "Men worth hiring aren't easy to come by in November. The ones without somewhere better to be aren't always the ones you want working your land." "No," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment in the stove-warmed quiet of the outbuilding. "I don't know why I told you that," he said, not embarrassed. Wondering, like a man discovering something about himself that surprised him. "Maybe because you needed to say it to someone," Marlowe said. "Maybe." He looked at the wrapped loaves on the rack. "I don't do that much. Tell people things, I know." "Does it—" He stopped. She waited. "Does it seem like a fault to you?" he asked. His voice was completely even. His eyes were not. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved rather than the reassurance he might have been half expecting. "I think keeping things inside is sensible when there's nobody safe to tell them to," she said. "And I think it becomes a habit that's hard to break even after the conditions change." He looked at her. The stove ticked. The wind moved against the stone walls. "You've had the same habit," he said. "I have," she said. "I still do." Something passed across his face, a kind of recognition that was also a kind of relief, the way you felt when you found out you weren't the only one who'd been navigating in the dark. "The bread's ready," she said, and handed him his loaf. He took it. His fingers brushed hers briefly, and neither of them commented on it, and Marlowe thought, riding home through the cold black November air, that she was in very serious trouble, and that this trouble had been coming at her since a Saturday in September when a man had fixed her table in 7 minutes and said nothing about it for the rest of the day. December was when the town decided to have opinions. She knew it was coming. Small towns always arrived at opinions eventually, and Rattler Creek was no different from any other. The supply of other people's business was limited, and the appetite for it was not. And a woman who had managed to be essentially invisible for 3 years had apparently become visible sometime in the fall. It started with Mrs. Hartley at the dry goods counter. Marlowe was buying flour, a routine errand. Nothing more when Mrs. Hartley, who had the round, pleasant face of a woman who considered herself a community conscience, said, "I see you've been spending your Fridays out at the Mercer place." Marlowe counted her coins. "I'm using the outbuilding for storage." "Yes, storage," Mrs. Hartley smiled. "How convenient." Marlowe looked up. "For flour sacks and cooling racks, yes." "Very convenient, of course." The smile didn't waver. "It's only people notice things, dear. In a town like this. A widow man and a single woman in no formal arrangement." "There is an arrangement," Marlowe said. "It's a loaf of bread per week. I can write it out if there's concern about the terms." Mrs. Hartley's smile thinned slightly at the edges. "People talk, that's all I'm saying. For your own sake." "Thank you," Marlowe said, in the tone she'd perfected over years of practice, warm enough to be unobjectionable, empty enough to contain nothing she intended to actually give. "I'll keep that in mind." She paid for the flour and left. Outside, she stood in the December cold with her flour and her temper, and told herself very firmly that Mrs. Hartley was irrelevant, and what Rattler Creek thought about her Fridays was not her concern. Then she went home and told Eleanor Thatch everything, because Eleanor was the one person she trusted to hear something and not repeat it. Eleanor listened, then sat back in her chair and said, "Do you care what they think?" "No. Do you care what he thinks about what they think?" A long pause. "I don't know." Eleanor studied her. "When did you last worry about what a man thought about anything?" Marlowe said nothing. "Right," said Eleanor. She didn't intend to tell Silas about Mrs. Hartley. It was a small thing, a tiresome thing, exactly the kind of social friction she'd always navigated alone, and saw no reason to bring to anyone else. But the following Friday, she arrived at the outbuilding, and he was already there, which was unusual. He never arrived before her, and he was replacing a split board in the wall with a look on his face that told her the board wasn't entirely why he was there. "Mrs. Hartley come to see you?" she asked, setting down her basket. He looked up, set down the board. Her husband did. "Yesterday afternoon." His voice was careful. "Said he wanted to pass along a friendly word about appearances." Marlowe took off her coat. Anne and I thanked him for his time and told him my arrangements with the building were a private business matter, and he was welcome to take that however he liked. He picked up the board again. He didn't look pleased. He wouldn't. He set the board down again. Turned to face her properly. "Does it cause you trouble?" "With the market." "With the women you sell to?" She thought about it honestly. "Some of them will think what they'll think, regardless. The ones I'd lose over this, I'd have lost over something else eventually." She looked at him. "Does it cause you trouble? With who your ranch hands? The men at the feed store, the circuit judge you have opinions about?" Something tightened at the corner of his mouth that was almost not quite, but almost a smile. "Ames told me I seemed less irritable on Fridays," he said. "I think that's the extent of the ranch commentary." She laughed before she could stop herself. It surprised them both. He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before, unguarded, in a way that had nothing cautious in it. Just open, just genuinely moved, like a man who'd forgotten what that sound did to a room. "Marlowe," he said, "just her name. No follow-up." She stopped laughing. They stood in the outbuilding with the cold pressing against the stone walls and the stove beginning to warm and her name still in the air between them. "Silas," just as quietly. And then they both looked away, and she started measuring flour, and he finished the board, and neither of them said another word for a full 20 minutes. But the silence was different now, carrying something it hadn't carried before. Something that didn't have edges but filled the space entirely. She almost lost everything in January. Not metaphorically, literally. A fire. It started in the blacksmith's yard on a Thursday evening faulty bellows, a spark on dry timber, and a wind that had no interest in being reasonable. Hector Blaine got his horses out and his tools, and that was about all he managed before the whole north end of the yard was burning. The fire didn't reach the main street. The bucket brigade from the livery and a shift in the wind kept it from spreading into the adjacent buildings. But Marlowe's old oven, the cast iron oven she'd been using since the blacksmith's yard arrangement, the one she'd hauled back and forth to market for years, was destroyed. The heat had warped the door and cracked the firebox and left it a useless hulk of expensive iron in a yard full of ash. She found out Friday morning. She stood in Hector's yard and looked at what was left of the oven she'd borrowed against for 6 months and paid off in installments, and she did not cry because she'd made that deal with herself too many times to break it over an inanimate object. She drove to the ranch. She hadn't planned to. She'd been driving home and taken the turn east without entirely making the decision consciously, the way your hands sometimes knew where you needed to go before your head caught up. Silas was in the yard splitting wood when she pulled up. He set down the axe and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him. All of it. Flat and factual, the way she delivered bad news, without embellishment or performance. The fire, the oven, the investment it represented. The fact that without an oven she had no product, and without product she had no income, and without income the savings she'd been carefully building toward that corner on Sulphur Street were going to get eaten by basic survival needs before spring arrived. She talked for 4 minutes straight. Then she stopped. Silas was quiet for a moment. He picked up the axe and set it against the woodpile and said, "Come in." She didn't want coffee. She wanted him to say something that would help, and she didn't know what that thing was. Which was the worst part. She'd always known exactly what she needed to solve every problem she'd faced, and this time the problem had too many parts, and she was standing in a ranch yard in January, unable to see around it. He put the coffee on anyway. She sat at the table and he sat across from it, and he said, "What's in the outbuilding right now?" "The stove," she said. "Cast iron, good draw, but it's a heating stove." "The flue is the same gauge," he said. "And I've got an oven box at the lumber mill that I ordered last spring for a project that didn't happen. It'll fit over a heating stove with the right modification. It won't be a bakehouse oven, but it'll take a pie and a loaf rack at the same time if you manage the fire right." She stared at him. "It's not ideal," he said. "Silas." Her voice came out different than she intended. Softer. "You ordered that oven box and you're only mentioning it now." "I didn't have a reason to mention it before today." That she stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table. "That's the most infuriating and also the most useful thing anyone has said to me in months." His mouth did the thing that was almost a smile. "You're welcome." They went to the outbuilding that afternoon. He knew what he was talking about. The box fitted with some work and some sheet metal from his own stores, and by late afternoon they had a working baking setup that was smaller than her old arrangement but solid and sheltered, and hers. He showed her how to manage the fire for even heat distribution. She showed him where the shelf configuration needed to be different from what he'd suggested, because she knew the physics of bread in a way he didn't, and he listened and adjusted without argument, which she found almost as remarkable as the oven box itself. By the time the first loaves were in, the winter dark was coming down outside the stone walls, and they were both tired and flour-dusted and sitting on whatever was available, she on the three-legged stool, he on an upturned crate, waiting for the first bake to tell her whether the setup would work. "It'll work," he said. "You don't know that yet. I know cast iron," he said. "And I know you. It'll work." She looked at him across the outbuilding in the low light of the stove. "Silas," she said carefully, "why are you doing all of this?" The question sat in the air between them. He didn't deflect it. He didn't offer a practical answer. "A building I'm not using, resources I have, a debt worth acknowledging." He sat with it for a moment and she watched him decide, very deliberately, to tell her the truth instead. "Because I come in from checking fences on Friday evenings," he said slowly, "and there's a light in that building, and I can smell bread from 30 yards away. And my house has been quiet for 3 winters, and I had gotten used to it being quiet. He looked at his hands. I don't want to get used to it again. She couldn't breathe for a moment. The stove ticked. The wind moved. That's she started. I know what it is, he said quietly. I'm not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know the reason. She sat with it. She sat with it for a long time while the bread baked and the outbuilding warmed and the winter pressed itself patiently against the stone outside. The bread's going to be good, she said finally. I know it, he said. And neither of them said anything else for a while, but the quiet between them now was full rather than empty full, in the way a house felt when someone had finally come home after a very long time away. And nobody needed to announce it, because the fullness said everything on its own. The loaves came out perfect. She knew they would. She'd stopped rushing things. But the week that followed would take everything she thought she'd learned about patience and test it in ways she wasn't ready for, because a man she hadn't thought about in years rode into Rattler Creek on a gray February morning. And when he dismounted in front of the dry goods store and pulled back his coat collar, Marlo Bennett's hands went still on her mixing table, and the color left her face completely. His name was Douglas Payne, and he was the reason she'd spent the last 4 years building a life with walls around it. Douglas Payne hadn't aged the way men who'd done wrong things were supposed to age. That was the first thought Marlo had, standing frozen at her mixing table with her hands in flour and her heart somewhere near the floor. He should have looked diminished. He should have looked like what he was, a man who'd taken something that didn't belong to him and walked away clean while someone else paid the cost. Instead, he looked prosperous, well-fed. His coat was good quality and his boots were new, and he carried himself with the particular ease of a man who'd never once lost a night's sleep over his choices. She had lost years over his choices. She pulled her hands out of the dough, wiped them on her apron, and stood very still while she decided what to do. Douglas Payne had been her mother's business partner's son. That was the clean version of the story, the version you could tell in mixed company, without watching people's faces change. The longer version was this: when Marlo was 22, and her mother had been dead 11 months, and she'd been trying to hold together the small baking arrangement her mother had built with a local provisions merchant. Douglas Payne had walked into her life with a business proposition and a way of talking that made everything sound inevitable. He was going to expand the operation, bring in investors, turn a modest neighborhood baking business into something that served 3 towns instead of 1. She'd trusted him. She'd signed papers she hadn't understood fully because he'd explained them in a voice that made her feel foolish for questioning them. When it fell apart, and it fell apart in under 8 months, the debts were in her name. The investors, such as they were, looked at Marlo Bennett, a 22-year-old woman with no family and limited legal standing, and they collected what they could from her and moved on. Douglas Payne had structured the arrangement very carefully. Nothing was in his name, nothing ever was. She'd spent 2 years paying back debts that weren't her fault, and 3 more years rebuilding from nothing, and she'd come to Rattler Creek specifically because nobody here knew that story, and she intended to keep it that way. And now Douglas Payne was standing 30 feet away on the main street of the town she'd rebuilt herself in, and he was talking to Gerald Prentice, her former landlord, the man who'd sold the storage property out from under her, and the two of them were shaking hands. Marlo's hands had gone completely still. She made herself move. She untied her apron and folded it and set it on the table with the careful deliberateness of a woman telling herself not to run. Because running was how you signaled that you had something to be afraid of, and she refused to be afraid of Douglas Payne. She was afraid. She walked to the window. They were still talking, Payne and Prentice, and now the hardware merchant had joined them, and from the body language easy open, the posture of men conducting legitimate business, Marlo understood that Douglas Payne had not come to Rattler Creek by accident. He'd come for a reason. The question was whether the reason had anything to do with her. She found out within the hour. Mrs. Hartley, who functioned as Rattler Creek's most efficient information distribution system, came into the market hall with her basket and her news at roughly the same time. And she delivered the news to no one in particular and everyone within earshot. A land developer out of Cheyenne was looking at the eastern quarter of town for a commercial expansion. Wanted to put up a proper hotel and an associated set of storefronts. The empty building on Sulphur Street was apparently part of the proposed footprint. Marlowe stood very still at her stall and heard the words her corner building filtered through Mrs. Hartley's excited presentation and felt something cold and specific travel through her chest. She knew what Douglas Payne's presence in a town meant. It meant someone was about to get moved. She told Eleanor that afternoon, all of it this time the real version, not the edited version. Including the papers she'd signed and the debts and the 2 years of repayment and the reason she'd come to Rattler Creek with nothing but a copper bowl and a skill and a very firm policy about trusting people. Eleanor listened without interrupting, which was one of her finest qualities. When Marlowe finished, Eleanor said, "Does he know you're here?" "I don't know. Would he recognize you?" "Yes, no hesitation." "We weren't strangers, Eleanor. That was the whole point." He knew exactly who he was dealing with. Eleanor's expression did something complicated. "And the building on Sulphur Street. I don't know if it's connected to me specifically or if it's coincidence." Marlowe pressed her hands flat on Eleanor's work table. "But I know Douglas Payne doesn't do coincidence. He does information. He finds out what people want and he positions himself between them and it. Then you need a lawyer I can't afford. The circuit judge will be in town Thursday," Eleanor said firmly. "His clerk takes appointments. You need to know your legal position before that man makes a single move." Marlowe looked at her. "Go see the judge's clerk," Eleanor said. "And then tell Silas Mercer. I'm not Marlowe." Eleanor's voice was quiet and direct. "You told me the man is the reason you've spent 4 years building walls around yourself. He's now standing in your town talking to your former landlord about your building. You can maintain your independence and still tell a trustworthy man what's happening. Those things are not mutually exclusive." Marlowe stared at the table. "I know," she said. "I know they're not. Then go." She went to the ranch that evening instead of waiting for Friday. It was the first time she'd come unannounced outside their established pattern, and she registered the significance of that, even as she tied her horse at the post and walked to the door. A year ago she wouldn't have done it. 6 months ago she might have talked herself out of it on the ride over. Tonight she knocked without deliberating. He answered immediately, like a man who'd been awake anyway. "Marlowe," he read her face in one look. "Come in." She sat at his table and told him about Douglas Payne. She told him the real version, the same way she'd told Eleanor the papers, the debts, the 2 years, all of it. Her voice stayed level throughout, because she'd had 4 years to make peace with most of it, and what remained was not shame but anger, which was entirely different and considerably more useful. When she finished, Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The building on Sulphur Street. Is it under option or just identified?" She blinked. She'd expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Sympathy, outrage on her behalf, something emotional. Instead, he'd gone straight to the practical question, which was actually exactly the right question, and she felt something in her chest ease slightly. "I don't know yet. I'm seeing the judge's clerk Thursday." "Good." He leaned forward on his forearms. "Prentice. He sold the storage property last summer?" "Yes, to who?" She frowned. "I assumed a private buyer. I didn't look closely at it. I was too busy being angry about losing the space." "I'd look closely at it," Silas said. She looked at him. "You think Payne bought it? I think a man who operates the way you're describing doesn't come to a new town and start with the biggest fish. He comes in from the side. He buys a small property, establishes a presence, builds relationships. He said it without drama, just thinking it through out loud. Prentice is an easy target. He's been trying to sell that property for 2 years. A buyer with cash asking no difficult questions would look like a gift. Marlowe thought about Douglas Payne and Gerald Prentice shaking hands on the main street. "He's already in," she said quietly. "Maybe," Silas straightened. "What do you need from me?" She'd thought about this on the ride over. She'd been very deliberate about it, because she knew the difference between asking for help and handing someone a claim over her situation. "Information," she said. "You know the property owners on that side of town better than I do. If Payne is buying up parcels, someone's been approached. I need to know who's sold and who hasn't. I can find that out. And I need to know if the building on Sulphur Street has received any offers. The owner is a woman named Calder, who moved to Denver 2 years ago. She's been trying to sell it through an agent here." "I know who handles it," Silas said. "Tom Reed at the assay office manages her interests here. He and I have dealt before. He was already thinking through it. I can talk to Tom tomorrow. I'm not asking you to—" "I know what you're asking," he said. "And I know what you're not asking." He met her eyes. "I'm not going to take this over, Marlowe. I'm going to find out what I can find out. Because I know the people and you don't yet, and then I'm going to tell you what I learned, and you're going to decide what to do with it. Is that acceptable?" She looked at him across the table. "Yes," she said, "that's acceptable." He nodded once. Got up and poured coffee she hadn't asked for, set it in front of her and sat back down. "Tell me the rest of it," he said. "What he did specifically. Not the broad outline. Why? Because I want to understand what we're dealing with." That word "we." She noticed it. She decided not to comment on it and to notice it anyway. She told him the rest of it. Tom Reed at the assay office confirmed it Thursday morning an offer on the Sulphur Street building had been submitted 2 weeks ago through an agent from Cheyenne, representing an investment group. Mrs. Calder's response had not yet been received. The offer was slightly below asking, but accompanied by a letter of financial backing from a Cheyenne bank that made it look serious. The circuit judge's clerk was less helpful. Without seeing the original papers Marlowe had signed 4 years ago in a different territory, he couldn't assess her legal position with any specificity. What he could tell her was that if the development moved forward, a woman with no formal claim on the Sulphur Street property had no legal standing to object to its sale regardless of her personal interest in it. She knew that. She'd always known that. What she hadn't known was that not having legal standing and not having any recourse were two different things. She discovered the difference that same Thursday afternoon when Douglas Payne walked into the market hall. She saw him before he saw her. She had that much advantage. He moved through the hall with his easy, informed manner, exchanging pleasantries with the hardware merchant's wife, accepting a sample from the cheese seller, working the room with the practiced naturalness of a man who did this professionally. Then he looked across the hall and saw Marlowe Bennett. He didn't miss a beat. That was what she'd always hated about him, the absence of hesitation. He changed direction and came toward her stall with a smile that she recognized from 4 years ago, warm and familiar and utterly constructed. "Marlowe Bennett," he said. "I'll be damned, Mr. Payne," she said. She was selling a jar of apple butter to Mrs. Garvey's niece, and she finished the transaction before she looked at him. She made him wait. "This is a surprise, is it?" He seemed genuinely amused. "I'm in the business of opportunity, Marlowe. Rattler Creek is full of it right now." He looked around the market hall with the appraising eye she knew well. "You've done well for yourself here. I heard about your baking operation." "You heard," she said. "You know how word travels." He spread his hands. Still that easy smile. "I had no idea you were in this town when I came out here. Genuinely. But I'm glad to see you're prospering." Marlowe looked at him steadily. "Are you, of course?" He leaned on her table with the casual intimacy of an old acquaintance. "Look, I know things ended badly between us before. That situation was complicated, and I've always regretted how it fell out for you specifically." "Have you, Marlowe?" He dropped his voice slightly. "Not threatening, confiding. I'm not here to cause you trouble. I'm here to develop a commercial block on the east end of town. It's a good project. Good for the town, Good for your investors, she said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He tilted his head. You know, there might actually be a place for a woman of your skills in what I'm putting together. A proper bakery, fitted out properly, capital I can access, terms that are workable. He paused. You've been doing this on your own for a long time. There are easier ways. She felt the pull of it, the way she'd felt it 4 years ago, not because she was foolish, but because he was genuinely skilled at making the impossible sound inevitable and the dangerous sound sensible. She also felt something harden in her chest like iron cooling in a cast. I'll think about it, she said, using the same tone she used with Mrs. Hartley. He recognized it, just slightly a flicker of recalibration behind his eyes. He'd always been quick, of course, he said pleasantly. No rush. He straightened, touched the brim of his hat. Wonderful to see you, Marlowe, I mean it. She watched him walk away. She sold 2 more jars of apple butter and a loaf of bread and smiled at the customers and said all the correct things. And when the market closed, she sat down on the stool behind her table and pressed her hands together in her lap and felt the cold knowledge of what was coming settle into her bones. He was going to buy that building, unless she stopped him. The problem was this: she didn't have the money. She'd known it for years and made peace with it being a future thing, a horizon she was moving toward, not a door she could walk through today. She had savings. Good savings, better than anything she'd managed before. But they weren't enough to buy a commercial building on a corner lot in a growing Wyoming town, and the bank in Rattler Creek had already told her, politely, when she'd inquired 6 months ago, that a single woman without property as collateral was a significant lending risk, and they'd want considerably more documentation than she currently possessed before entertaining a loan conversation. She went to Silas that evening. He was at the fence line when she arrived, working with Ames on a section that had heaved in the frost. He saw her coming and said something to Ames and walked over to the gate. He read her face the way he always read it, directly and without comment. What happened, he said. She told him about Payne's offer. The bakery he'd dangled, the building and the timeline she'd estimated based on Mrs. Calder's likely response time. How long, he said. If she accepts the offer, the sale could close in 6 weeks. Maybe 8 if there are complications. Silas was quiet. He pulled off his work gloves and held them in one hand and looked at the middle distance the way he did when he was calculating. The bank turned you down before, he said. Not a question. 6 months ago, preliminary inquiry, they wanted collateral. Property or business interest, either. He nodded slowly. I have property, he said. She went very still. As collateral, he clarified immediately, his voice careful. Not as a gift, not as a loan from me directly, as a cosigner on a banknote. My land is paid free and clear. It would satisfy their collateral requirement. He met her eyes. The loan would be yours. The business would be yours. The building would be in your name. I'd be on the note as a guarantor, which means if you default, might. I won't default, I know you won't, he said it simply. That's why I'm offering it. She stood at his fence gate and looked at him and felt something enormous and complicated, moving through her gratitude and fear, and the particular kind of vulnerability that came from being offered exactly the thing you needed, by exactly the person you most wanted to be strong in front of. Silas, she said, if this goes wrong, it won't. You can't know. I know the baker, he said. I know what she's built with nothing. I know what she'll do with something. He held her gaze. I'm not being reckless, Marlowe. I'm making an informed decision. Those are different things. She looked at him for a long time. I need to think about it, she said. Take the time you need, he said. But not more time than you have. She didn't take the whole night. She rode home and sat with the copper bowl in her lap and thought about Douglas Payne's smile and her mother's instruction about patience and Silas Mercer standing at her fence gate with his work gloves in his hand making an informed decision. She thought about what it meant to accept help from someone who wasn't trying to own what he helped you build. She thought about the difference between a man who'd offered her a business arrangement designed to make her dependent and a man who was offering his name on a piece of paper, specifically so the business would be entirely hers. She went back to the ranch before dark. He was on the porch when she rode up, like he'd been expecting her. Like he'd known she wouldn't stay away long. "Yes," she said before she'd even dismounted. He nodded once, like it was settled. "I'll go to the bank Monday morning," she said. "I'll be there at 9, he said. She tied her horse and came up the porch steps and stood in front of him and said, "I need you to understand something. Tell me, this doesn't change the arrangement. The building is mine. The business is mine." If she stopped, recalibrated. "Whatever else happens between us, the bakery stays mine. It's not part of any other negotiation. Ever." He looked at her with an expression that was completely serious, and also contained, somewhere very far in its depths, a warmth that he did nothing to hide. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. She believed him. That was the thing, she believed him completely, and without reservation, which was not something she had believed about anyone in 4 years. And the understanding of it hit her standing on his porch in the February dark, like the first warm day after a killing frost. She believed him. "All right," she said. They stood there for a moment. "Coffee," he said. "Yes," she said. She followed him inside. The cream-colored shawl was still on its hook by the window. She noticed it the way she always noticed it. But tonight it looked different, not like a barrier, not like a closed door, but like a thing that had been loved and was still held carefully, which was not the same as being held in the way of living people who needed to move forward. She sat at his table and he put coffee in front of her and sat across from her, and they talked about practical things: the bank meeting, the documentation she'd need, the timeline against Payne's offer, and underneath all of it ran something that didn't need to be said because they were both already living inside it. She left at 8:30. Silas walked her to her horse. At the gate he said, "Marlowe." He said it in the way she'd said it in the outbuilding in January, not attached to anything, just her name as its own complete sentence. She looked at him. He reached out and adjusted the strap on her saddlebag that had been sitting twisted for the last 20 minutes. Just fixed it, the same way he'd fixed her table in 7 minutes, and said nothing about it for the rest of the day. She put her hand over his for just a moment, just a second. No more. Then she mounted and rode back toward town in the cold February dark, and she did not look back, but she could feel his eyes on her all the way to the first turn in the road, and she did not mind it at all. The bank meeting Monday morning went the way bank meetings went, when a man with paid-off land walked in alongside the applicant. The manager, a Mr. Forsyth who had been professionally discouraging to Marlowe 6 months prior, was considerably more attentive with Silas Mercer seated beside her. She noticed this without surprise and filed it under the long, ongoing list of things that were unjust about the world and had to be navigated rather than corrected in any given moment. She answered every question herself. Silas sat beside her and said nothing unless directly addressed, which was not often. He was there to sign the guarantee. He was not there to explain her business to a banker who ought to have been listening to her from the start. The loan was approved in principle, pending documentation. Walking out of the bank into the cold morning air, Marlowe felt something lift off her chest that had been sitting there since Tuesday morning in July, when she'd first read that letter in her rented room with the copper bowl in her hands. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We haven't stopped Payne, we will." He looked at her sidelong. "You're confident." "I'm angry," she said. "That's better." The corner of his mouth did what it did. "Yes, it is." They walked down the main street of Rattler Creek in the February cold, not quite together and not quite apart. And Marlowe thought about the building on Sulphur Street and the morning light through the southeast window and the name she intended to put on the glass door. She thought about Douglas Payne's offer and how smoothly he'd delivered it. And she thought about the fact that he hadn't come to her table to offer partnership out of goodwill. He'd come because he'd found out she wanted that building. which meant he knew her better than she'd realized. Which meant he'd done his research before he'd walked through that market hall door. She stopped walking. Silas stopped beside her. He knew, she said. Before he came over to my stall, he already knew I'd been trying to get that building. Silas was quiet for a beat. Who would have told him? She thought about Gerald Prentice. She thought about the property Prentice had sold, the storage property, the one Douglas Payne had most likely purchased. She thought about a man who dealt in information, assembling a picture of a town he intended to develop, property by property, conversation by conversation. Prentice told him, she said. Maybe not deliberately. Maybe just talking. Payne is very good at getting people to tell him useful things without realizing they've done it. Then Payne walked into the market hall, knowing you wanted the building, Silas said slowly. And he offered you a partnership. Yes. Why offer you a partnership if he intends to buy it anyway? She thought about it. The answer came in the way Douglas Payne's answers always came, not dramatic, not grand, just quietly calculated. Because if I'm inside his arrangement, she said, I can't fight it from outside. And he knows I have enough standing in this town that I could make his project difficult if I was opposed to it. My customers, Eleanor, the market relationships I've built. She looked at Silas. He's not offering me a bakery, he's buying my silence. Silas held her gaze. His jaw was set. He underestimates you, he said. Most people do, she said. I've stopped being offended by it. It's more useful when they don't see you coming. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she'd come to understand as his version of being thoroughly and completely on her side. What's the play, he said. She thought about it for one more moment. I need to talk to Mrs. Calder directly, she said. Not through Tom Reed. Not through an agent, the woman herself. If I can reach her in Denver before she responds to Payne's offer. I can get you a letter of introduction, Silas said. I know a man in Denver who did business with her husband before he passed. That won't guarantee anything, but it'll get your letter read. She looked at him. You know someone in Denver, she said. I know people, he said with a simplicity that made her almost laugh. All right, she said. Then I need to write the best letter of my life. You will, he said, like it was already done. She looked at the dry goods store across the street. She looked at the market hall. She looked at the corner of Sulphur Street, 2 blocks down, where the building waited with its southeast window and its southeast light, and everything she'd spent 4 years building herself toward. She thought about Douglas Payne and his easy smile and the papers he'd handed her when she was 22 years old, and she thought about who she was now compared to who she'd been then. She was not the same woman. Not even close. Let's go write the letter, she said. And she walked not hurried, not frantic, but with the particular steady momentum of a woman who had already decided toward the rest of her life. The letter took 3 drafts. The first was too formal, stiff, with the particular defensiveness of a woman who knew she was asking for something and didn't want to look like she was asking. The second went too far the other direction, too personal. Too much of Marlowe's history exposed on the page, in a way that invited sympathy rather than respect. And sympathy was not what was going to win a property negotiation with a widow in Denver who had never laid eyes on her. The third draft was the right one. She wrote it at Silas's kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, while he sat across from her reading a survey report on his eastern fence line and not offering any opinions unless she asked for one, which she found more useful than she would have predicted. Having someone present who trusted her to get there on her own was, she was discovering, considerably more steadying than advice. She read him the final version when she was done. He listened all the way through without interrupting. When she finished, he said, the third paragraph, the part about your mother. She'd written about her mother building a baking business alone in the years after Marlowe's father died. About the copper bowl. About what it meant to build something with your hands that bore your own name. Too much, she said. No, he shook his head slowly. It's the truest thing in the letter. Any woman who built her own life will recognize it. He looked at the page. Send it as written. She sent it Wednesday morning through the Denver Express Post, along with Silas's letter of introduction from his contact there, a man named Horace Webb, who'd apparently done a land survey for Mrs. Calder's late husband 12 years prior. It wasn't much. It was enough to mean the envelope wouldn't go straight into a pile of correspondence from strangers. Then she waited. Waiting was the hardest thing she'd ever been asked to do, and she'd been asked to do some genuinely hard things. Douglas Payne didn't wait with her. He moved through Rattler Creek, the way he moved through everything smoothly, purposefully, with that particular talent for making each person he spoke to feel like they were the most important conversation he'd had all week. Marlowe watched it happen from the market hall, and from the street, and from Eleanor's second-hand reports, and she recognized every move, because she'd seen them all before. He bought Prentice a drink at the saloon, and called him a visionary for identifying the development potential on the east end of town. He stopped by the hardware store and discussed building material costs with the merchant in a way that left the man feeling like a consultant rather than a source. He attended the church social. She heard this from 3 different people and felt the audacity of it like a physical sensation and complimented Mrs. Hartley's organizational skills with a precision that suggested he'd done his research on exactly which compliment would land best. He was building a town, not the kind you built with lumber and labor. The kind you built with relationships and mutual interest and the carefully manufactured sense that his success was everyone's success. She'd seen it work before, in a different town, with different people. It worked because most people wanted to believe that a prosperous-looking stranger with good manners and a bank letter from Cheyenne was exactly what he presented himself to be. What he'd never counted on, 4 years ago and apparently again now, was a woman who'd already been taken apart by his methods and had spent 4 years understanding every piece of how they worked. She was at her stall on Thursday morning when he came in again. This time he didn't make her wait. He came directly to her table, bought a loaf of bread, paid fare. She noted, Douglas Payne always paid fare for small transactions because it was good theater, and said, "Have you given any more thought to what we discussed?" "Some," she said. "The offer I mentioned. A proper bakery in the new development." He said it pleasantly, like a man discussing the weather. "I've been looking at the space. I think it could be something real." "What space specifically?" she said. He smiled. "The corner building on Sulphur Street." "You already know it. I've been told it was on your list." She looked at him. "You've been told. People talk, Marlowe." Same words he'd used the first day. A small test to see if she'd react to the reminder of their shared history. "I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to create an opportunity that benefits both of us." "And what would my role be exactly?" she said. "In this arrangement?" "Head baker. Creative control over the product. I handle the capital, the construction, the business side." "You do what you do best." He spread his hands. "Open, reasonable, inevitable. You've been doing this alone for too long. There's no shame in having a partner." The word partner sat between them on the table, next to the bread loaf and the apple butter jars and the careful arrangement of everything she'd built alone. "I'll need to see the terms in writing," she said. Something flickered in his eyes, the satisfaction of a man who thought he was watching someone bend. "Of course. I'll have my agent draw something up." "I'll have my own review done as well," she said. The flicker adjusted itself. "Naturally, and I'll need 2 weeks. He paused. 2 weeks was longer than he wanted to give her. She could see him calculating. "I can give you 10 days, he said. "The seller in Denver is expecting a response." 2 weeks, Mr. Payne," she said. "If your offer is as sound as you say, 10 days shouldn't make the difference." He looked at her. The easy smile didn't leave his face, but something behind it sharpened just slightly. 2 weeks, he said. He left. Marlowe sold a jar of preserves to the woman next to her who'd been listening to the whole exchange with wide eyes, and she said nothing about it, and gave the woman her change and watched Douglas Payne cross the market hall with his easy walk. And she thought about 2 weeks and the Denver Post and a letter she'd sent to a woman she'd never met. She thought about her mother's voice. You can't rush a good thing into being ready. Then she thought, but you can make sure the other side runs out of time first. Silas heard from Horace Webb on Friday. Not about Mrs. Calder's response that hadn't come yet. Webb had written on a separate matter entirely. Douglas Payne's investment group out of Cheyenne was not, as it turned out, exclusively his. There were 3 named partners. 2 of them had been involved in a land dispute in Laramie County 2 years prior that had ended badly for several small property owners who'd been bought out at below market value under the representation that the development would bring them profit participation. It hadn't. Silas put the letter in his coat pocket and rode into town. He found Marlowe in the outbuilding, finishing the Friday batch. He waited until she'd set the last loaves to cool before he put the letter on the table in front of her. She read it twice. Laramie County, she said, 2 years ago. 4 families sold based on profit participation promises that were never documented in the actual purchase agreements. He sat down on the crate. When the development completed, there was no participation. The verbal promises weren't binding. She looked at the letter. This is what he did to me, the same structure. Verbal understanding, written terms that said something different. She pressed her hand flat on the paper. He's been doing this the whole time. Webb says there was an inquiry. Nothing came of it legally because the families had signed the papers, and the papers didn't support the verbal claims. His voice was level and exact. But the inquiry is a matter of record. She understood what he was saying. The circuit judge, Thursday. He's here Thursday. She looked up. Will he see me? He'll see me, Silas said. And I'll bring you. She studied him. Silas, this could make an enemy of Payne before I've secured the building. He's already your enemy, Silas said. He was your enemy 4 years ago. The only question is whether you know it while he's operating or after. She held his gaze. He was right. She knew he was right. She'd spent too long being sensible about men who weren't being sensible about her. Thursday, she said. Thursday, he confirmed. He picked up his bread loaf, set it down again, looked at her with an expression that had something underneath it she hadn't seen before. Not worry, not uncertainty, but a kind of careful weight, like a man holding something he wasn't sure how to say. What, she said. Payne came to the ranch yesterday, he said. Everything in her went still. What did he want? To talk about my eastern fence line? Silas's voice was absolutely level. Specifically, the portion that borders the Creek Road property that I lease to Ames for grazing. He was interested in whether I'd consider selling the grazing rights. He wants your land, she said. He wants access to the water source on my eastern boundary, Silas said. The Creek Road property is worthless for development without reliable water. My land is the only adjacent holding that has it. She stood very still. He came to you before or after you know about the Laramie inquiry. Before he could have known I knew anything. Silas looked at her directly. He came to buy something I have, and while he was there he mentioned casually, the way he does, that he'd been talking to you. That he was hoping to bring your baking operation into his development. The room was very quiet. He was establishing a connection, she said slowly, between your land and my business. He was showing you that he had something you might care about. Yes. He thought you'd want to protect what was between us, she said. He thought if he could make you uncertain about his intentions toward me, you might be more inclined to negotiate on the water access. Silas said nothing. He didn't need to. What did you tell him? She said. I told him the eastern boundary wasn't for sale or lease, and he was welcome to find his water elsewhere. He paused. And then I wrote to Horace Webb. She looked at him across the outbuilding in the late Friday light. He miscalculated, she said. He thought I'd want to protect you by accommodating him, Silas said. He was wrong about what protecting you means. She felt something move through her that was not gratitude exactly. It was bigger than that, and more specific, The feeling of being understood by someone at exactly the right depth, not too little and not too much. Just the exact amount that didn't make her smaller. "Thank you," she said, "for not accommodating him." "You didn't need accommodating," Silas said. "You needed the truth about what he was doing." She nodded, turned back to her cooling racks, then stopped. Silas. He's going to come back to you. When the judge inquiry goes forward and he realizes someone's been gathering information. She kept her back to him, because what she needed to say next was easier to say to the wall. He'll try to use whatever's between us against us both. He did it before, with people I cared about. He found the places where I was attached and he put pressure there. "I know," Silas said. She turned, and he looked at her with complete steadiness. "And he's welcome to try." The circuit judge's name was Harlan Bright, and he was a small man with a large reputation for impatience with people who wasted his time and a particular coldness toward fraudulent land arrangements. Which was something Silas had known, and Marlowe had not until they were sitting in front of his desk Thursday morning. She laid out the Laramie County inquiry. She laid out what she knew of Payne's method, the verbal promises, the written terms that contradicted them, the 4 families who'd lost what they'd been told they'd gain. She laid out Payne's arrival in Rattler Creek, the purchase of Prentice's property, the offer on the Sulphur Street building, the approach to Silas about the water access. Judge Bright listened without expression. When she finished, he said, "You have documentation of the Laramie inquiry." "Webb's letter," she said, "and I've written to the Laramie County Clerk for the record of the proceeding." "That'll take time," she said. "I bought myself 10 days. Bright looked at her, then at Silas, then back at her. "The Cheyenne Bank backing his offer," he said. "Do you know which institution?" "First Territorial," she said. "His letter to Mrs. Calder's agent named them." Bright wrote something down. Said nothing about it. Wrote something else. "I can't stop a legitimate property sale," he said. "If Mrs. Calder accepts his offer and the terms are clean, I have no jurisdiction." "I know that," she said. "What I can do," he said, still writing, "is make an inquiry to the Laramie County Court regarding any outstanding matters related to the named principals of his investment group. And I can write to First Territorial Bank regarding the business history of those principals before they issue a letter of financial backing for a Wyoming development project." He set down his pen. "Banks don't like questions from circuit judges. It slows things down." Marlowe looked at him. "How long would that slow things down?" she said. "Depends on how thorough a man I am," Bright said. He said it without expression, but his eyes held something dry and deliberate. "I can be very thorough." Silas beside her said nothing. But she felt his stillness shift slightly, the quality of a man holding back something that might have been a smile. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Bright said. "Get me that Laramie documentation." She got it. The Laramie County Clerk responded in 8 days faster than she'd hoped, slower than she'd feared, and the document that arrived was exactly what she needed. 3 of the 4 families had filed formal complaints. The complaints had been dismissed on the grounds that the written agreements hadn't promised what the families claimed verbally, but the record of the complaints was their names, dates, the specific nature of the misrepresentations alleged. She brought the document to Judge Bright on a Wednesday. He read it, wrote 2 letters in front of her, sealed them, handed them to his clerk. She walked out of the judge's office into the March air and stood on the wooden sidewalk with her hands shaking slightly for the first time since this whole thing had started. Not from fear, from the particular physical response to sustained tension, finally releasing the way a rope felt when the load it had been holding was finally set down. Silas was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He looked at her face. "Done, done," she said. He nodded. "Come on, I'll buy you coffee." She laughed. An actual laugh, sudden and genuine, and he looked at her with that expression, the one she'd first caught in the outbuilding in January, open and unguarded, moved by the sound of her laugh in a way he didn't try to conceal anymore. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Come on." Mrs. Calder's response arrived on a Friday. It arrived at the assay office addressed to Tom Reed, which was standard, and Tom sent word to Marlowe because she'd asked him to. And she walked to the assay office with her coat, not fully buttoned, because she'd come directly from the outbuilding and hadn't stopped to think about the cold. Tom Reed was a practical man with a respect for confidentiality and also a clear understanding that the situation had become something beyond routine property correspondence. He read her the relevant portion of the letter. Mrs. Calder had received the offer from Payne's agent. She had also received Marlowe's letter and Silas's letter of introduction. She was not accepting Payne's offer at this time. She was, however, open to a direct conversation with the woman who'd written to her about copper bowls and mothers and names on glass doors. Marlowe stood in the assay office with her coat open in the March cold and read that sentence twice. She was open to a conversation. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't the door slamming shut either. It was exactly what a careful woman gave another careful woman when she wasn't sure yet, but was willing to find out. Tom Reed looked at her over his desk. "I can arrange a telegraph correspondence if you'd like to pursue it." "Yes," she said. "Please." She walked back out into the March morning and stopped on the sidewalk and pressed both hands against her sternum and breathed. Then she went to find Silas. He was at the hardware store, loading lumber into his wagon, and he looked up when she came around the corner and read her face in 1 second flat. "She didn't accept his offer," Marlowe said. He set down the lumber. "And she wants to talk to me." He stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "Good, just that. Good, not I told you." Not relief performed for her benefit, just the plain certain satisfaction of a man who'd known what she could do and watched her do it. "I need to write another letter," she said. "You'll need the telegraph," he said. "Tom Reed has the equipment." "I know, I just came from there." She looked at him. "Silas, she's in Denver. If she wants a real conversation." "I know," he said. "I'd have to go to Denver, I know." She looked at him steadily. "That's a 4-day trip at minimum." "I know what it is, Marlowe." His voice was even and warm. "Go to Denver. Talk to the woman. Buy your building." She held his gaze. I'm not anything except certain that you can handle this." He said it with absolute simplicity. "Go." She went back to the telegraph office and composed the most careful message of her life in 43 words, which was all the telegraph rate she could sensibly spend, and Tom Reed sent it that afternoon. Mrs. Calder's response came the next morning. She would see Marlowe in Denver. Thursday of the following week, 11 o'clock. She was gone 5 days. Silas fed the oven in the outbuilding to keep the frost off her equipment. He didn't tell her he was doing it. She found out from Ames when she came back, because Ames mentioned it in passing while helping her unload the wagon, with the casual tone of a man reporting something unremarkable. She stood in the outbuilding doorway for a moment, after Ames walked away, and looked at the stove that had been kept going for 5 days for no reason except that it was hers. Then she went to find Silas. He was in the barn. She came in and he looked up from what he was doing and said, "How did it go?" She had a signed letter of intent in her coat pocket. Not a purchase agreement, those things took lawyers and time, but a letter from Mrs. Calder stating her preference to sell the Sulphur Street property to Marlowe Bennett rather than any other party, contingent on Marlowe securing the full purchase amount within 30 days and presenting a formal offer through Tom Reed. She put the letter on the workbench in front of him. He read it. "Read it again." 30 days, he said. "The bank loan is approved in principle," she said. "Forsyth needs the final paperwork, and Calder's letter of intent is sufficient to move him forward." He looked up. Something in his face that she'd come to know as his deepest version of being moved, still and quiet and entirely real. "What did you say to her?" he said. "In Denver." She thought about the meeting. A woman of 60, sharp-eyed, who'd asked direct questions and waited for direct answers. Who'd read Marlowe's letter twice during the meeting and asked about the copper bowl and whether she still had it. "I told her the truth," Marlowe said, "about what I wanted to build and why. And about Douglas Payne and what his offer actually meant for the east end of town. She paused. And I told her about the letter of introduction, about the man who put his name on a banknote so a woman he believed in could own something of her own. Silas went very still. She asked if he was a good man, Marlowe said. And I told her yes. Without hesitating, the barn was quiet. The horses were quiet. Outside, the March wind had finally lost its killing edge, and there was something in the air that was almost not yet, but almost the beginning of spring. Marlowe, he said. Silas, she said back. He stepped around the workbench and stood in front of her, and she looked at him directly the way she looked at everything she'd decided not to be afraid of. I've been wanting to say something to you, he said. For a while, I know, she said. I want to say it right, he said. I've been thinking about how to say it right for some time, and I don't want to get it wrong, because I got things wrong before with Evelyn, not wrong between us, but wrong after. I held on to wrong things and let the wrong ones become walls. He held her gaze. I don't want to do that again. She waited. She gave him all the time he needed. I don't need you, he said. I want to be very clear about that first, because I know what need looks like when it's dressed up as something else, and it's not fair to either of us. My house was quiet before you, and I managed it. My ranch runs. I'm not a man asking a woman to save him. I know you're not, she said. But my life is better with you in it, he said. Every part of it. The parts I can explain and the parts I can't. You are the clearest-eyed person I have ever known, and the most honestly stubborn, and you have never once let me take anything from you didn't choose to give, and I love that about you. His voice was steady, and it cost him something to keep it that way. I love you, Marlowe. Not the baker. Not the woman who fixed my house or kept me company on Fridays. You, the whole difficult, capable, particular you. She stood very still. You're not going to tell me what this means for the ranch, she said. Or what you need. No, he said. You're not going to ask me to choose between the bakery and anything else. No, not ever. He said it like bedrock. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd fixed her table and kept her building warm, and put his name on a banknote without putting his name on her dream. This man who'd sat on a crate in her outbuilding in January and told her his house had been quiet for 3 winters in a voice that asked for nothing. This man who'd stood beside her against Douglas Payne and never once tried to stand in front of her. I love you too, she said. I have for a while. I was being careful about it. I know, he said. So was I. She reached out and put her hand against his jaw the same way she put her hands against bread dough when she was checking whether it was ready, certain, attentive, completely present. The building will take 6 weeks to renovate, she said. I'm going to need the outbuilding through the summer. It's yours, he said. And I'm going to need someone to hold the measuring line, she said. When I start laying out the counter, he looked at her. His hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his face. That, he said, I can do. She leaned forward and kissed him, because there was nothing left to be careful about and no more reason to hold the distance between wanting something and letting herself have it. The barn was quiet and warm, and outside the March wind had finally, definitively, given way to something softer, and Douglas Payne's agent received Judge Bright's letter of inquiry from the Laramie County Court the following morning. And First Territorial Bank placed a hold on the letter of financial backing pending review. And the offer on the Sulphur Street building lapsed without response, while Marlowe Bennett was already at the bank with her paperwork, and Silas Mercer's signature on the guarantee line. The building was hers by the end of the month. She stood in it alone the first evening after the sale closed. No equipment yet, no shelving, no oven, just the empty space, and the southeast light coming through the window, and the floor that needed work, and the back wall that needed attention, and the front glass that needed a name on it. She pressed her hands against the window frame. Outside, the main street of Rattler Creek moved through its ordinary evening horses, wagons, the hardware merchant's boy misses. Hartley with her basket, all of it familiar, all of it hers in the way a town became yours when you'd chosen it deliberately and defended your place in it and refused to be moved. She thought about her mother and the copper bowl, She thought about Saturday mornings and apple pie, and a man who'd fixed her table in 7 minutes and said nothing about it for the rest of the day. She thought about 50 Saturdays and one plate instead of a paper wrapping, and the way everything that mattered had started right there, not with a declaration or a grand gesture, but with a small, instinctive act of invitation from a woman who hadn't even realized she was extending one. She took out a piece of chalk she'd brought it specifically and wrote on the bare interior wall, in large uneven letters that no one would ever see once the plaster went up, Bennett Bakery. Just to see what it looked like. It looked exactly right. The chalk letters came down when the plasterers arrived. Marlowe watched them go without sentimentality. She'd seen them every morning for 3 weeks while she worked alongside Silas and a hired carpenter named Gus Fielding to gut the interior and rebuild it into something that could hold a commercial operation. The chalk had done its job. She didn't need it anymore. The name was already real. It existed in the deed folded in her bureau drawer, in the loan documents at Forsyth's bank, in the conversation she'd had with Tom Reed when he handed her the keys and said, with genuine feeling, that it was about time somebody put that corner to good use. Bennett Bakery was real whether the letters were on the wall or not. The renovation was harder than she'd anticipated, and went faster than she'd feared, which was the particular arithmetic of work done by people who cared about the outcome. Silas showed up every morning before she did, and was still there when she left in the evenings. He never tried to run the project. He showed up with tools and did what was asked, and occasionally offered an opinion when he had expertise. She didn't load-bearing walls, drainage slope, the correct way to anchor a cast-iron range into a stone floor so it didn't shift when the seasons changed. She listened when he knew more than her, and he listened when she knew more than him. And Gus Fielding watched the two of them operate and said nothing until the 3rd week, when he told his wife over supper that he'd never seen two people communicate so much with so few words, and his wife said that sounded about right for those two. The oven arrived from Denver in the 1st week of April. It was not the largest commercial range available, but it was solid and well made and had enough capacity to run a real Saturday operation plus weekday bread production. And when Silas and Gus maneuvered it through the back door and set it on the anchored base they'd built for it, Marlowe stood back and looked at it, the way she'd looked at the building from outside for 4 years, the way you looked at something you'd stopped yourself from wanting too much because the distance between wanting and having had seemed too dangerous to measure. "You're not saying anything," Silas said. "I'm taking it in," she said. He stood beside her and looked at the oven and said nothing further. He understood taking something in. She had discovered, one of the rare people who knew the difference between a silence that needed filling and one that needed honoring. She fired the oven for the first time that afternoon, just to test the draw and check the temperature distribution. She baked nothing. She just watched it work, listened to the iron tick and expand, felt the heat come out even and consistent from front to back the way a good range did, and she thought about her mother's borrowed oven in the cold back room of someone else's kitchen. And she thought about the warped hulk of iron in Hector Blaine's burned yard. And she thought about Silas's outbuilding with the 3-legged stool against the wall, and the loaves she'd pulled from the improvised oven box on a January night while the winter pressed against the stone. She thought about how far she'd carried everything to get to this room. "It's a good oven," she said. "It is," he said. "The front right corner runs slightly hot," she said. "I'll need to account for that. Rotate the pans at 20 minutes rather than 25. He looked at her. "You can tell that already. I've been baking for 16 years, she said. "Yes." He shook his head slowly in a way that was not disagreement, but something more like ongoing appreciation for a skill he would never fully understand. Which was one of the things she loved about him, the genuineness of his respect for what she knew that he didn't. "Come on," she said. "Help me measure the counter run." Bennett Bakery opened on the 1st Saturday of May. Eleanor Thatch had made a small sign for the window white paint on dark wood, clean letters, and hung it the night before while Marlowe was inside doing the final prep. Marlowe came out and saw it in the lamplight from the street and stopped walking. She stood there for a full minute. Eleanor came up beside her and didn't say anything, because Eleanor understood when not to talk. "Thank you," Marlowe said finally. "It's a good sign for a good shop," Eleanor said. "Now go home and sleep. You've got to be up at 4. She was up at 3:30. She hadn't planned that. Her body just decided for her, the way bodies did when something was too important to risk sleeping through. She dressed in the dark and walked to the bakery and let herself in through the back and stood in her own building for a moment before she lit the lamp. Just standing in the dark with the smell of new plaster and pine lumber and the faint metallic warmth of an oven that had been seasoned over the past 2 weeks. Her building, her oven, her name on the glass, she lit the lamp and went to work. The bread went in at 5, the first pies at 6. She had 4 varieties: apple chess, dried cherry, and a sour cream pie her mother had made only at celebrations, which Marlowe had decided this was. The cinnamon rolls, which she'd started offering experimentally at the market in February, and which had outsold everything else immediately, went in at 6:30 in 2 batches. Silas arrived at 7 with 2 of his ranch hands, who he'd apparently told there was a grand opening happening and they were going to be there. They stood in the front room looking large and somewhat uncertain until Marlowe handed each of them a cinnamon roll and told them to sit down, which they did with the immediate compliance of men who'd been standing in the cold and were now being offered something warm. By 8 o'clock there were people on the sidewalk outside. By 9 she'd sold out of cinnamon rolls. 10, she was baking a 3rd round of bread, because the first 2 had gone completely and people were still coming in. Eleanor came at 10:30 and immediately positioned herself at the counter to help manage the line without being asked, which was exactly the kind of thing Eleanor did. Marlowe caught her eye across the shop and Eleanor raised one eyebrow in a way that said everything about how this was going and nothing about "I told you so," which was why Marlowe loved her. Mrs. Garvey came. Mrs. Garvey's daughter came, the newly engaged one with the domestic enthusiasm, and bought 4 jars of preserves. The hardware merchant came and told Marlowe she'd done a fine thing with the building, and she thanked him and meant it. Hector Blaine came and she gave him a loaf on the house because of his yard and the lost oven, and he took it with a dignity that suggested he understood exactly what the gesture meant. Mrs. Hartley came at 11. She looked at the shop. She looked at the line. She looked at Eleanor behind the counter, and Silas standing near the back wall with his coffee, watching the whole thing with the quiet satisfaction of a man present at something he'd believed in from the beginning. She looked at Marlowe. "Well," she said, "I suppose it was a good corner after all." "It was always a good corner," Marlowe said. "Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Hartley. Can I interest you in a pie?" Mrs. Hartley bought 2. By noon, Marlowe had sold more in a single morning than she typically sold in 3 full market Saturdays. She was tired in a way that had nothing depleted about it, the bone-deep tiredness of effort that had gone exactly where you meant to put it. She was washing her hands in the back when Silas came through from the front room. "You're out of apple pie," he said. "I know," the woman with the red coat asked specifically. "Tell her Tuesdays and Saturdays, those are the apple days." "She can come back Tuesday." She dried her hands. "How many people are still out front?" 8 or 9. She took a breath. "All right." He was looking at her with that expression, the open one, the January one, the one that had nothing cautious left in it. "What?" she said. "You did it," he said. She looked at him. "We're not done. There are still 8 people out front." "Marlowe, Silas." He took one step forward and took her face in both his hands and kissed her, which was unexpected enough that she was momentarily at a loss for a practical observation, and when he stepped back his eyes were the warmest she had ever seen them. "You did it," he said again. "Let that land for 1 second before you go back to counting customers." She let it land. "It was a good second, all right," she said. 1 second, and then she went back out front. June arrived and the business found its rhythm. Not Effortlessly, nothing worth keeping came effortlessly, and Marlowe had no patience with the version of success that was supposed to look inevitable in hindsight. The first month had 3 hard weeks in it. The flour supplier she'd arranged terms with delivered a short order in the second week, and she had to spend 2 days renegotiating while rationing inventory. The city water arrangement she'd expected to have access to through the building's existing connection had a broken pipe that took a plumber and more money than she'd planned. One of her Saturday helpers, a young woman named Clara Adkins who'd been reliable for 2 weeks straight, disappeared on a Thursday with no explanation and came back on Monday with the news that she'd gotten engaged and her intended didn't want her working. Marlowe said congratulations and asked if she'd like to continue anyway. Clara looked at her like this was a revolutionary suggestion. "He won't like it." "Does he have a reason?" Marlowe said carefully, "other than preference?" "Well, no, I suppose not." "Then that's between you and him," Marlowe said. "The job is here if you want it. I'm not going to decide for you, but I'll tell you that you're good at this work, and good work is worth keeping." Clara thought about it for 2 days and came back on Wednesday. She told Marlowe that her intended had said all right, if she was that set on it. She looked like a woman who'd discovered she had more standing in her own life than she'd realized, which Marlowe recognized, because she'd looked approximately the same way at 22 before Douglas Payne had temporarily disassembled that understanding. She made sure Clara's disassembly didn't come from working at Bennett Bakery. The business grew because Marlowe was competent, and because the town needed what she was offering, and because she was, at her core, the kind of person who simply outworked the alternative. But it also grew because Silas Mercer came in on Saturday mornings and sat at the small table she'd put near the window and ate his apple pie and drank his coffee and talked to whoever sat down near him, which was everyone eventually. Because people gravitated toward Silas the way they gravitated toward anything that was steady and real and didn't want anything from them. She'd noticed this about him early on and had never said it aloud until one June evening, when they were sitting on the bakery steps after closing, too tired to go anywhere immediately, just existing in the warm evening air. "You know what you do," she said. "Probably several things," he said. "Which one?" "When you sit at that table on Saturdays," she said. "People come and talk to you, and then they come back. And some of them come back and buy things." He looked at her. "I'm eating pie, Marlowe. I'm not running a marketing strategy." "I know you're not. That's why it works." She looked at the street. "You're a good advertisement for a bakery you don't own." "I own 20% of it," he said. She turned to look at him. "You own a bank guarantee that you may never have to honor." "That's not 20%. It's something. It's something," she agreed. She leaned slightly against his shoulder. He put his arm around her, easy and complete, the way people did when they'd gotten past the uncertainty of whether they were allowed to. "I've been thinking about the summer market. There's a woman in Cheyenne who makes jams commercially and sells to hotels. I want to talk to her about a supplier arrangement." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd buy her product?" "Under my label. With a fair arrangement that she understands fully and has reviewed before signing." She said it precisely. "Not the way Payne does it. The way people should do it." "Does she know you're interested?" "Not yet. I'm going to write to her next week." She paused. "Eleanor thinks I should go to Cheyenne myself." "Eleanor's right," he said. "I know she is." Marlowe tilted her head back slightly. "I went to Denver. I can go to Cheyenne. You can go anywhere," he said. She smiled. She didn't say anything else. The evening sat around them comfortably, which was one of the things she'd discovered about loving the right person. The comfort didn't diminish the feeling. It was part of it. The way a good oven didn't cool a kitchen but kept it warm consistently, without burning anything. She thought about Evelyn Mercer's shawl. She hadn't looked for it in a while. It wasn't that she'd forgotten it, she couldn't forget it. It had been part of how she'd understood Silas from the beginning. But sometime in the winter, between the outbuilding and the bank meeting in Denver, it had stopped being a barrier in her mind and become simply a thing that was true about him. He had loved a woman and lost her, and carried her carefully. That was not a failing. That was the mark of a man who knew how to love at all. She'd never asked about it directly. She wasn't sure she needed to. But that evening on the bakery steps, in the June quiet, she said, "Tell me about Evelyn." He was still for a moment. She laughed too loud, he said. She always knew it, and she never tried to fix it. He looked at the street. She burned things. Not careless like she'd be paying attention and still burn things. Said her mind moved faster than the kitchen. A pot. She would have told you that first week you fixed that table. She never would have let a crooked table go 4 months without saying something. Marlowe smiled. What would she have said? Something direct and probably unkind about the person who built it, he said. She wasn't mean. She just didn't have much patience for halfway work. I would have liked her, Marlowe said. He looked at her. She would have liked you, he said. She would have said you were the same. The first time she met someone she respected, she didn't flatter them. She just talked to them, like they already understood each other. Marlowe held that. Does it? She know, he said. Quiet and certain. Loving you doesn't diminish her. I spent 3 years thinking it would. I was wrong about that. He looked at the street again. She'd be irritated with me for wasting 3 years, honestly. Marlowe laughed. She heard the realness in it, not the complicated tangle she'd half expected, but the clean feeling of a thing that had resolved itself honestly. She sounds like she was something, Marlowe said. She was, he said. So are you differently. Equally. He said it simply the way he said true things. I don't need you to be her, and I don't need to forget her to love you. I've figured that out now. She pressed her hand against his, and he turned it over and held it. They sat on the bakery steps in the June evening, until it got too dark to sit comfortably. And then they went inside, and she showed him the new shelving configuration she'd been planning, and he told her the third shelf was going to have a weight problem at full capacity, and they argued about it pleasantly for 20 minutes. Which was the kind of argument that felt like closeness rather than distance. Douglas Payne left Rattler Creek in July. He didn't announce it. He was simply present 1 week and absent the next, and the word that filtered through the usual channels was that the Cheyenne investors had gotten cold feet after Judge Bright's inquiry letters had done their work with First Territorial Bank. Without the bank backing, the development proposal couldn't move forward. Without the development proposal, there was nothing in Rattler Creek for Douglas Payne. Marlowe heard the news from Eleanor on a Wednesday morning. She set down the bread she was wrapping and said, "All right." Eleanor waited for more. "That's it," Eleanor said. What else would there be? Marlowe tied the bread paper. He's gone. The building's mine, it's done. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. You're not even a little bit satisfied, Marlowe said. Yes, briefly. Yesterday when I heard he was preparing to leave, she looked at Eleanor. But I've been done being angry at Douglas Payne for a long time. He was useful. He made me move faster than I would have otherwise. I'd rather not waste any more time on him. Eleanor shook her head. You're a very particular kind of person, you know that. So I've been told, Marlowe said. She went back to the bread. Eleanor bought a chess pie and a jar of cherry preserves and told her she'd see her Thursday, and Marlowe said yes and meant it and felt the clean satisfaction of a problem that had resolved itself and left no residue. The residue, if there was any, was positive. She was stronger in the community than she'd been before. People who'd watched the Payne situation from a careful distance and had seen how it resolved had come away with a specific understanding of Marlowe Bennett. She was not a woman you could move around. Judge Bright had mentioned, in a brief and characteristically understated exchange at the market, that her documentation of the Laramie situation had been more thorough than he'd seen from people with legal training. She'd thanked him. He'd bought a loaf of bread and left. Gerald Prentice had avoided her for 2 months, which she accepted as appropriate. In August he came into the bakery, bought a pie, and said, with the stiff dignity of a man who owed an apology and was going to give a watered-down version of it. I didn't know what that man was when I talked to him about the East End properties. Marlowe looked at him for a moment. No, she said. You didn't know. She handed him his change. He's good at being what people want to see, mister. Prentice. Prentice nodded, started to leave, stopped. Your mother would have been proud, he said, of the shop. He left before she could respond, which was probably for the best, because she wasn't sure her voice would have been entirely steady. She stood behind her counter and pressed her hands flat on the wood surface she'd chosen herself, and had sanded herself and had sealed with a beeswax mixture on a Saturday evening 3 weeks before opening, and she breathed. Just breathed. Her mother would have been proud. Yes. She thought that was probably true. Silas proposed in September. Not dramatically. Nothing about Silas Mercer was dramatic, and she wouldn't have wanted it differently. He'd been out at the ranch for 3 days, dealing with a fence line situation that had escalated. A neighboring property had changed hands, and the new owner had a different understanding of the shared boundary than the survey supported. And Silas had been back and forth with the man in the measured, firm way he handled disputes, which was to say without raising his voice and without conceding an inch. He came to the bakery on a Wednesday evening after it was closed, which he sometimes did when he was in town late. She was doing the accounts that were in the black, solidly in the black, for the 2nd month running, and he sat across from her at the small window table and put a cup of coffee in front of her that he'd made himself from the back kitchen, which he knew how to use now, which was a small domestic intimacy that she'd stopped noticing and therefore completely relied on. She kept working on the accounts. He sat with his own coffee. After a while he said, the boundary dispute is settled. How? Survey from 1879 is definitive. The new owner was working off a hand-drawn map from a real estate agent who was wrong. He said it without triumph. He's not a bad man, he just had bad information. What's he like? She said without looking up. Young. Came out from Ohio with his wife and 2 small children. Trying to make something work. He paused. I showed him where the actual boundary runs. Invited him to supper Thursday. Thought you might come. She looked up. You invited the neighbor who was disputing your fence line to supper and included me. His wife doesn't know anyone here yet, he said simply. Thought you might have that in common. She looked at him. This man who fixed tables and kept ovens warm, and used his land as collateral for other people's dreams, and invited boundary disputants to supper because their wives were lonely. Yes, she said, I'll come Thursday. He nodded, looked at his coffee. Looked at the accounts she'd been working on. Are you still short for the supply arrangement with the Cheyenne woman? He said. No, it closed last week, I told you. You told me it was close. You didn't say it closed. I'm sorry, it closed. The first delivery comes in October. Under the Bennett label, her name on the invoice, fair split. She looked at the numbers in front of her. It's going to change the winter significantly. I can maintain volume in the slow months. He was quiet. She could feel him thinking. Marlowe, he said. Something in his voice made her put down her pencil. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, the way he did when he was organizing something he'd been planning to say for a while and wanted to get it exactly right. She'd learned to wait when he did this. She was good at waiting now. She'd been practicing since September of last year. I don't want to wait anymore, he said. To get married. He stopped. I've been thinking about the right time and the right way to ask, and I've realized that I'm doing the same thing I've done before, waiting until everything is in order before I let myself have the thing I want. He looked up. I don't want to do that anymore. She looked at him. I'm not going to make it complicated, he said. I'm not going to tell you what changes and what doesn't, and negotiate the terms of it. You know what I think. You know I'd never ask you to give up a single thing you've built. His voice was even and real. I just want to know if you'll marry me. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a Saturday in autumn a year ago when she'd been at her market table with a bank letter folded against her ribs, and her hands were shaking, and he'd walked up and ordered his pie the same as always, and she hadn't looked at him right. Away because she'd been holding herself together with both hands. She thought about the creek road and the cottonwood trees, and the moment she'd stopped leaning away from him. She thought about Denver, and the letter about copper bowls, and the signed letter of intent in her coat pocket, and a barn in March, and the first day she'd told him she loved him, which had felt not like falling but like arriving. She thought about how much she'd carried alone, and how it felt different now, not lighter, because she hadn't put any of it down, but better distributed. Shared with someone who didn't try to take it from her, but simply stood close enough that the weight spread differently. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it the way he held everything that mattered, carefully, and without performance. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They stayed at the small window table until the lamp needed trimming, talking about nothing particularly significant, which was the best kind of conversation to have when you'd just agreed on something that was going to shape the rest of your lives. The wedding was October. Small because that was what they both wanted, and neither of them had ever been people who toward ceremony to make things real. The church held maybe 60 people and was full anyway, because the town of Rattler Creek had been watching this unfold since autumn of the year before and felt a proprietary affection for the outcome. Mrs. Hartley cried, which surprised everyone, including Mrs. Hartley. Hector Blaine stood in the back and clapped loudly enough to embarrass the people nearest him, which was consistent with everything Marlowe knew about Hector. Clara Adkins came with her intended, who turned out to be a reasonable young man once you got past his ideas about wives working, and who shook Silas's hand with the genuine respect of someone meeting a man he'd heard good things about. Judge Bright was present, which was not something Marlowe had arranged. He was in town on circuit business and came because he'd heard about it, and apparently decided his schedule could accommodate an hour. He didn't say much. He bought a slice of chess pie at the reception, which Eleanor had organized at the bakery, and told Marlowe that she ran a tight courtroom. She told him she'd take that as a compliment. He said she should. Silas's ranch hand Ames came and stood near the back with his hat in his hands, looking extremely uncomfortable in his good shirt, and became visibly relieved when Marlowe walked over specifically to thank him for keeping the outbuilding warm for 5 days in February, because it meant he could talk about work instead of feelings. Eleanor stood beside Marlowe when the minister asked his questions, and handed her the ring when it was time, and did not cry, which was a deliberate act of self-control that Marlowe recognized and appreciated. Tom Reed from the assay office came with his wife and son. Several of Marlowe's regular customers came. The young Ohio family from Silas's neighboring property came. The wife, whose name was Jane, had become a weekly customer at the bakery, and had the slightly dazed look of a woman who'd been lonely for months and had recently discovered a community, which Marlowe recognized because she'd had the same look once. The reception was warm and loud and full of the particular joy that comes from people gathered around that took a long time and a lot of work to arrive at. The chess pie ran out first. The cinnamon rolls ran out second. The apple pie, the one Silas always ordered, the one this entire story had started with, she'd made 4 of, and she served the first slice on a plate to Silas specifically, as a joke only the two of them understood. He looked at the plate and looked at her and said, low enough that only she could hear, "You putting it on a plate again?" "Only if the baker comes with it," she said. He kissed her in front of 60 people, and Hector Blaine started clapping again, and Mrs. Hartley had to sit down. The first winter of marriage was the hardest. Not between them it was the easiest time she'd had in years. The particular ease of 2 people who'd been lonely for a long time and now had someone to come home to. But the bakery was hard. The Cheyenne supplier arrangement hit a snag in November when the woman's warehouse had a water problem and a full delivery was delayed by 3 weeks, which meant Marlowe had to ration product heading into the holiday season when demand was highest. She always adapted, but the margins were thin for 6 weeks, and there was one Thursday in December where she sat at the accounts, and the numbers were close enough to frightening that she felt the old cold weight of financial precarity settle on her chest like it had never left. Silas sat down across from her that same Thursday evening and looked at her face. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The numbers, the delay, the margin, the holiday demand she was only partially meeting. She told him flatly and completely the way she'd learned to tell him things, without performing distress and without editing out the hard parts. He listened all the way through. Then he said, "The Cheyenne woman. Is the warehouse problem fixable, she says, by January?" I believe her. Then it's a 6-week problem, not a permanent one. The margins in those 6 weeks. "We'll recover in February when she delivers," he said. "You've run the numbers on the other side?" She had. She showed him. He looked at the numbers. "You're going to be fine," he said. "You don't know." He said it the way he'd said it in the outbuilding in January, in the barn in March, on the bakery steps in June, with the particular certainty of a man who had watched her operate for 15 months and was basing his assessment on evidence rather than sentiment. "You're going to be fine. The supplier will deliver. The holiday margins will catch up in the new year. You know this." She looked at him. "I know it," she said. "I just needed to say it to someone before I knew it." "That's what I'm here for," he said. She looked at him across the table, this man who had put his name on a bank guarantee and not his name on her dream, who said the right thing the right way with the specific understanding of someone who'd paid close attention to who she was, who sat with her on hard Thursdays and never suggested that the answer was to stop trying. "Yes," she said. "It is." She reached across and covered his hand with hers, and they sat together with the Denver cold outside, and the lamp warm between them, and the accounts spread on the table, showing numbers that were tight but holding. The way everything worth keeping was sometimes tight but held. The Cheyenne delivery came in January. The February numbers were the best the bakery had produced. The holiday shortfall recovered entirely by March. She told him so, on an evening when the accounts were completely, clearly, undeniably in order. He said, "I know." She said, "You were right." He said, "Write it down." "I'm told it's rare." She threw a kitchen towel at him. He caught it and smiled. The years settled into themselves the way good things did, not with a dramatic announcement, but with the quiet accumulation of days that were better than they might have been. Bennett Bakery became part of Rattler Creek, the way essential things became part of places not noticed as a presence, but felt immediately as an absence when it wasn't there. The Saturday market tradition continued even after the bakery was permanent. Marlowe kept a small outdoor presence in warm months, because the market was where she'd started, and it connected her to the customers who'd been with her from the beginning. And she was not a woman who forgot where she'd started. Clara Adkins kept working there, and eventually became the person who ran the morning bread production, which freed Marlowe to manage the supply relationships and accounts, and the occasional conversation with other women in town who came to her quietly, the way women in small towns came to other women they trusted with questions about business, about managing money, about what it took to keep something of your own, without apologizing for wanting it. She talked to all of them. She was direct. She gave real information rather than comfortable vagueness. She told the ones who asked about Douglas Payne the broad strokes of that story without drama, because the specific mechanics of how a man like that operated were more useful information than general warnings, and she believed in useful information. Silas's ranch grew steadily. Not dramatically, he wasn't a man who pursued dramatic growth, but consistently and soundly, which was his way. The boundary dispute neighbor from Ohio, whose name was Frank, became a genuine friend. Silas helped him through his first Wyoming winter with the matter-of-fact generosity of a man who remembered what it was to be new to something. And Frank became the person who most reliably bought Marlowe's bread on Tuesdays, which she found fitting. The cream-colored shawl stayed on its hook. She never suggested moving it. It would have been the wrong thing not because she was afraid to, but because there was nothing to be afraid of. Evelyn Mercer had been real and had been loved, and the evidence of that love was not a competing claim on Silas's heart, but the proof that he had one. Marlowe had made her peace with that understanding completely and without remainder. She did, one spring evening, ask if she could touch it. Silas looked at her with an expression that was surprised, and then moved, and then settled into something clear and still. "Yes," he said. She held the corner of the shawl for a moment. Wool good quality, faded from cream to the color of old paper. She thought about a woman who laughed too loud and burned things because her mind moved faster than the kitchen. She thought about the particular loneliness of a man who'd kept every object in its place for 3 winters, because changing anything felt like loss. She let go of the shawl and went back to her accounts. Silas stood near the window for a moment. "Thank you," he said. She wasn't entirely sure what he was thanking her for. She thought he might not have been entirely sure either. But it was real, whatever it was, and she accepted it. The daughter was born 3 years after the wedding. They hadn't discussed children with the kind of direct negotiation they'd applied to most things, because some things arrived in their own time and made their own case, and this was one of them. She was born in April, which was Marlowe's favorite month, in the ranch house bedroom, with a doctor and Eleanor both present, because Eleanor had simply arrived and refused to leave, and the doctor had quickly understood that this was not a situation to argue about. She had Silas's gray eyes and Marlowe's particular expression of assessment, that measuring, deciding look that both of them recognized immediately, and looked at each other over the baby's head, with specific shared amusement of parents who understand exactly what they've made. They named her Ruth, which had been Marlowe's mother's name. Silas had suggested it before Marlowe had said it, which was one of those moments that came sometimes between two people who'd been paying close attention to each other for long enough, when they arrived at the same place from different directions and found each other there. Ruth grew up in a bakery and on a ranch in equal measure. She knew the smell of bread before she knew many other things. She knew how to sit still on a porch and watch cattle in a way that her father had apparently been able to do since childhood. She had opinions about pie crust from an early age that were not always correct, but were always delivered with a certainty that her mother found both exasperating and deeply familiar. She asked questions constantly. She wanted to know the reason for everything: why the bread needed to rest, why the cattle had to rotate pastures, why the building on Sulphur Street had her mother's name on the glass instead of her father's. Marlowe answered every question directly. On the building question, she said, "Because I built it." Your name goes on what you build. Ruth considered this with the focused deliberateness of a 4-year-old processing a principle. "What if 2 people build it?" she said. Marlowe looked at Silas, who was standing near the bakery door with his coffee, listening. He looked back at her with that expression, the one from January, the one that had never really changed in all the years between then and now, open and certain and completely real. "Then both names go on it," Marlowe said. "But only if both people actually built it." "Did Papa build it?" "He held the measuring line," Marlowe said. "What does that mean?" Marlowe said. Ruth looked at Silas. "What does it mean?" He crouched down to her level, which he always did when she asked him something serious. He considered the question the way he considered all questions, with genuine attention. "It means," he said, "sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is hold the line steady so they can measure true. You don't do the building. You make sure the measurements are right." He looked at Ruth. "It doesn't sound like much, but everything that goes up crooked is crooked because nobody held the line." Ruth thought about this for a moment. "I want to hold the line," she said. "You can hold the line," he said. "You can also do the building. You don't have to choose." She accepted this with the satisfaction of a child who'd gotten a real answer rather than a simplified one, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. And Silas stood up and looked at Marlowe, and Marlowe looked back at him. She thought about Saturday mornings in a mudlot market with a crooked table and a bank letter folded against her ribs. She thought about the first time she'd put a slice of pie on a plate instead of wrapping it to go, the small unplanned gesture that had changed everything, without announcing that it was doing so. She thought about how little she'd believed, that Saturday morning, that the thing she most wanted was already standing at the end of her table. The bakery was full, the bread was in. Ruth was running between the front room and the kitchen, with the particular acceleration of a child who had learned that the kitchen smelled good and the front room had people in it, and both of these things were interesting. Silas was at his table near the window with his coffee and his pie, the same table he'd sat at every Saturday for years, looking out at the main street of Rattler Creek with the unhurried attention of a man who was exactly where he'd chosen to be. Marlowe stood behind her counter in her bakery, in her building, in the town she'd decided to belong to, with her name on the glass door and flour on her hands, and everything she'd once believed was too dangerous to want built solidly around her. And she understood, finally and completely, what her mother had meant all those years ago, that you couldn't rush a good thing into being ready, that the crust always knew if you'd been impatient, that the result told on you if you'd tried to force it. She hadn't forced this. She'd shown up, Saturday after Saturday, and done the work in front of her, and let the rest come around in its own time. And it had come around. Every last piece of it had come around. Silas looked up from his table and met her eyes across the bakery, and she saw in his face the same thing she'd seen in his voice on the ranch porch on an October evening, that clear, unguarded certainty of a man who'd stopped being afraid of what he wanted and had discovered that one hadn't diminished anything, had only made everything larger. She smiled at him. He raised his coffee cup, the smallest possible gesture, the kind only two people who'd been paying close attention to each other for years would recognize as everything it was. She turned back to her bread. This was what she'd built, not just the bakery, not just the business, not just the financial independence she'd once thought was too ambitious to want. She'd built a life that bore her own name and held the people she'd chosen and asked her to surrender none of herself to keep it. That was the thing Douglas Payne had never understood about her, and the thing Silas had known from the beginning. She was not a woman who would trade herself for security, or trade herself for love, or trade herself for anything at all. She was a woman who would build, and keep building, until she had something that didn't require the trade. She had it now. She had had it for years. And every Saturday morning when the light came through the southeast window and landed on the floor in that wide, warm rectangle she'd fallen in love with, years before she ever walked inside, Marlowe Bennett stood in it for exactly one moment before the morning's work began, because some things deserved to be felt before they were used. Then she went to work. Because the bread was in and the customers were coming and the name on the glass was hers and the life behind it was exactly, permanently, irreversibly the one she had chosen. And that was not the beginning of anything. That was the whole point.